Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I have used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value for my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would from any major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of the card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Welcome to the definitive CEDH compilation of Najeela the Blade Blossom. Najeela is defined by card quality, efficiency, and relevance. She generates tokens upon attack and can go infinite with multiple A+B combos. You have multiple backup lines for redundancy in case you lose access to your commander, and having a 5-color commander allows you to have access to all of the best cards ever printed. With a wide variety of flexible slots to adjust to any given meta, Najeela is one of the best decks in the format. But Rebel has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Peer into the Abyss. Ben draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts Carpet of Flowers. Ben passes. Justin draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Lotus Petal. He cracks his petal for a blue and casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Justin ends his turn. Alex draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He passes. Rebel draws and plays a Morphic Pool. She casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Polluted Delta. Rebel then casts a turn 1 Rhystic Study. Finished up, the turn moves to Ben. Ben draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Grand Abolisher. Rhystic triggers and Rebel draws. With nothing else, Ben ends his turn. During his upkeep, Justin loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Ben with Malcolm. Ben takes the hit and Malcolm triggers. Justin creates a treasure, and in his second main phase, he cracks his treasure to cast Imperial Seal. Rhystic triggers and Justin pays. Seal resolves, and then he fetches up a card into the top of his library and loses 2 life. Justin ships the turn. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus and casts his commander, Kennen, Bonder Prodigy. Rhystic triggers and Rebel draws. Kennen resolves and the turn moves to Rebel. Rebel draws and plays a Marsh Flats. She casts Birgi, God of Storytelling. Rebel cracks Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. She casts a Lotus Petal. Birgi triggers and adds a red. Rebel then cracks her petal to cast her commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. Birgi triggers and adds a red again. With nothing else, Rebel ships the turn. Ben draws, and in his first main phase he adds a green through his carpet. He casts his commander, Safi Ericsotter. Rhystic triggers and Ben pays. He moves to combat and attacks Justin with Grand Abolisher. Justin takes it and Ben ends the turn. During his upkeep, Justin wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Chrome Mox, paying the Rhystic tax. Mox resolves and he imprints Snap. He moves to combat and attacks Rebel with Malcolm. Rebel takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. All finished up, Justin gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and starts off his turn by playing a Turn Timber, Serpentine Wood into play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts a Grim Monolith, Rhystic triggers, and Rebel draws. Alex then pays 2 life to cast Phyrexian Metamorph, Rhystic triggers, and Rebel draws. In response, Justin casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Grim Monolith. Rhystic triggers and Rebel draws. Monolith bounces to Alex's hand, and he decides not to continue the chain. Metamorph then enters as a copy of Birgi. Next, Alex casts Fine Horn Elves. Birgi and Rhystic trigger, and then Rebel draws and Alex adds a red. With nothing else, Alex ends his turn. Rebel draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. She moves to combat and attacks Justin with Birgi and Najeela. Najeela triggers, creating a 1/1 warrior tapped and attacking Justin. Justin takes the hit, and Rebel ends the turn. Ben draws, and in his first main phase he adds a green through his carpet. He plays a Branch Loft Pathway. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Renegade Rallier, paying their Rhystic tax. Rallier enters and Ben moves to combat. He attacks Justin with Safi and Abolisher. Justin takes the hit and Ben shifts the turn. During his upkeep, Justin loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Grim Monolith, paying for Rhystic. Monolith resolves and he moves to combat. He attacks Rebel with Malcolm. Rebel takes the hit and Malcolm triggers. Justin creates a treasure and then passes the turn to Alex. Alex draws and recasts Grim Monolith. Bergie and Rhystic both trigger. He pays for Rhystic and then creates a red through Bergie. Alex activates Kinnan, looking at the top 5 and revealing a Tidespout Tyrant, putting it onto the battlefield. The table suddenly becomes super worried and Alex moves to combat. He attacks Justin with Bergie and Kinnan. Justin takes the hit and Alex ends his turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Rebel cracks her Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Still in the end step, Rebel casts Vampiric Tutor. Bergie triggers and adds a red. It resolves and then she fetches up a card onto the top of her library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Rebel. Rebel draws and starts off her turn by casting a Jeweled Lotus. Bergie triggers and adds a red. She casts Phantasmal Image, adding a red through Bergie. Image resolves and enters as a copy of Grand Abolisher, stopping her opponents from casting spells or activating abilities during her turn. She casts Intuition, targeting Alex. Bergie triggers and adds a red. Intuition resolves and she fetches up a Lion's Eye Diamond, Savine's Reclamation, and an Underworld Breach. Alex gives her Lion's Eye Diamond and the rest go into her graveyard. She casts LED. Bergie triggers and adds a red. She cracks LED, discarding her hand, and adds 3 white. Rebel then flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting LED. LED enters, Savine's copies, and the copy returns Underworld Breach to the battlefield. Rebel then escapes Intuition from her graveyard, targeting Alex. She fetches up a Brain Freeze, Thassa's Oracle, and an Unearth. Alex gives her Unearth and the rest go into her graveyard. With Abolisher shutting out Rebel's opponents from doing anything, the table concedes the game to Rebel. Sean wins the Skyline Chili eating competition and gets to start us off. But Alex has 2 pre-game actions. He puts Leyline of Anticipation onto the battlefield and Leyline of the Void onto the battlefield. Sean draws a card for turn and plays a Fiery Islet. He taps his Fiery Islet to cast a turn 1 Mystic Remora. Already sitting in an equally strong position as Alex, Sean passes the turn. Alex draws a card for turn and plays an Exotic Orchard. With his Leyline of Anticipation providing him the ability to play when it's most strategic for him, he passes the turn. Zane draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Finehorn Elves. Zane passes. Mike draws and plays a Badlands. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Mike cracks his Lotus, exiling it to Leyline of the Void to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. Mike ends his turn. During his upkeep, Sean taps his Fiery Islet to pay for his Remora. He draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn. He casts a Wild Growth on his Rejuvenating Springs. Mana set up and his Remora well fed, Sean passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Alex flashes in a Deathrite Shaman through Leyline of Anticipation. Alex draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Alex passes. Zane draws and casts a Mana Crypt. Then Sean draws through Remora. Zane casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He follows it up with a Tinderwall. Zane passes. At the end of Zane's turn, Mike casts a Vampiric Tutor. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Mike fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Sean draws. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. The table knows this is trouble and Dockside resolves. It enters and Mike creates 5 treasures. Mike moves to combat and attacks Sean with Najeela. Najeela triggers and Mike creates a warrior tapped and attacking Sean. Sean takes it, and with no other actions, Mike gives the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays a Tropical Island for turn. He taps his Fiery Islet to cast a Mana Vault. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand and adds a red. He casts his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Trade Routes. He shifts the turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Alex flashes in a Talisman of Dominance. Remora triggers and Sean draws. The turn moves to Alex. Alex draws and, still sitting on his Leyline of Anticipation, takes no actions and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Jessica's Will, targeting Sean. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Zane then adds 7 red and exiles Chrome Mox, Gemstone Caverns, and a Birds of Paradise. He plays a Gemstone Caverns for turn. The table braces as he pays 2 life to help cast Birthing Pod. Remora and Crom trigger and Sean draws for both. To everyone's surprise, Birthing Pod resolves. He pays 2 life to activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Finehorn Elves. Everyone knows what powerful 2-drop creature he's going to get. Mike, sitting on a pile of treasures, passes priority on the activation. The ability resolves, and Zane fetches up Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Then Mike decides not to crack his treasures. Zane then creates 14 treasures. Zane casts Neoform, sacrificing Dockside Extortionist. Zane fetches up a Glenhorn Buccaneer onto the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter through Neoform. He attempts to move to combat, but in response, Alex taps his talisman to help cast Praetor's Grasp, targeting Mike. Remora triggers and Sean draws. It's at this point that Mike explains how his list is extremely greedy and runs next to no removal spells. Mike and Alex discuss for a long time, and eventually, Alex exiles a card from Mike's library face down. Alex then casts March of Swirling Mists, exiling a blue card, targeting both Glenhorn Buccaneer and Malcolm. Remora and Crom trigger, and in response, Zane casts Swan Song, targeting March of Swirling Mists. Remora triggers and Zane pays. In response, Mike casts Eladamri's Call. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Mike fetches up a Derevi Imperial Tactician into his hand. With Swan Song still in the stack, Alex pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Swan Song. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Misstep counters Swan Song, and Sean draws off of his Crom and Remora. Finally, March of Swirling Mists resolves, and Glenhorn and Malcolm are phased out. With nothing else, Zane passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Mike attempts to move to combat, but in response, Zane casts Snap, targeting Derevi. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Snap resolves, Derevi bounces, and Zane untaps 2 lands. Mike moves to combat and attacks Sean with Najeela and a warrior token. Najeela triggers and he creates 2 more warriors, tapped and attacking Sean. Sean declares no blocks and takes it all. In his second main phase, Mike casts Imperial Seal. Crom and Remora trigger, and Sean draws for both. In response, Sean pays 2 life to help cast Mental Misstep, countering Imperial Seal. With its plans foiled, Mike passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sean sacrifices his Mystic Remora. During his draw step, he takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He follows it up with a Lotus Cobra. He plays a Windswept Teeth for turn. Cobra triggers and he adds a green. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adds another green, and casts his other commander, Kodama of the East Tree. In response, Alex casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Kodama. In response, Sean casts Swan Song, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Trap is countered and Alex creates a 2/2 bird. Kodama enters, and then Sean cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. Kodama and Lotus Cobra trigger. He adds a green through Cobra, and then he puts a Taiga onto the battlefield through Kodama. Lotus Cobra triggers again, and he adds another green. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Lotus Cobra as an additional cost. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. It enters, Kodama triggers, and in response, Mike and Zane crack their treasures. Then Sean creates 6 treasures and gets 6 more Kodama triggers. He puts a Mana Confluence, Gemstone Caverns, Yavimaya Coast, and an Exotic Orchard onto the battlefield, and then finally a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Tireless Tracker. Kodama triggers and he puts an Endurance onto the battlefield. Endurance enters and Alex puts his graveyard onto the bottom of his library. Sean taps his Fiery Islet to cast Shatterskull Smashing where X equals 4, killing Mike's Dockside and Najeela. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Crom. Mike takes it, and Sean, dismayed that he couldn't piece together a win this turn, has to give the turn to Alex. Alex draws and casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Deathrite Shaman and Zane with his bird. Both take it, and in his second main phase, Alex pays 2 and draws 2 through Timna. He plays a Bayou for turn. With everyone running out of answers, Alex ships the turn to Zane. Before his untap, Zane's creatures phase in. He draws and then pays 2 life to activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Tenderwall. He fetches up a Spellskite onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Glenhorn and Alex with Malcolm. They both take it, and Malcolm triggers twice. Zane creates 2 treasures, and still in combat, Zane activates Glenhorn Buccaneer, discarding a card and drawing a card. Glenhorn triggers and deals 1 damage to each opponent. Malcolm triggers and Zane creates 3 treasures. He presents a loop of discarding and drawing cards through Glenhorn, creating treasures, and pinging his opponents down until they are dead, and Zane wins the game.
Robert won the kangaroo boxing match and gets to start us off. But Zane and Zach have a pre-game action. Zane puts a Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield with a luck counter, exiling Veil of Summer. Zach also puts a gemstone into play with a luck counter, exiling Plateau. Robert draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. In response, Jacob pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering Soul Ring. A little dismayed, Robert ends his turn. Zane draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Tinderwall. He sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He ships the turn. Zach draws and starts off his turn by casting Chrome Mox. It enters, and Zach imprints Force of Negation. He plays Ancient Tomb. He taps Ancient Tomb and casts a turn 1 Smothering Tithe. With his hand now completely empty, Zach passes the turn. Jacob draws, and Zach's Smothering Tithe triggers. Zach creates a treasure. In his first main phase, Jacob plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond. It enters, and he discards Polluted Delta. He casts a Soul Ring. All finished, he passes. Robert draws, not paying for tithe. He plays Savannah. He casts Wild Growth, targeting Savannah. He gives the turn to Zane. Zane draws, not paying for tithe. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Malcolm. Zach takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers. Zane creates a treasure, and he passes the turn. Zach draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to cast his commander, Narset, Enlightened Master. To Zach's surprise, Narset resolves, and with nothing else, Zach ends his turn. Jacob draws, not paying for tithe. He pays 2 life to cast Gataxian Probe, targeting Robert. Jacob looks at Robert's hand and draws a card. Tithe triggers, and Zach creates a treasure. Jacob plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He gives the turn to Robert. Robert draws, not paying for tithe. He plays a Bayou. He casts Sylvan Library. He passes. Zane draws, not paying for tithe. He casts Glinthorn Buccaneer. The table braces for impact, and Buccaneer resolves. Zane moves to combat, and in response, Jacob casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting Buccaneer. Buccaneer is destroyed, and Zane creates a 3/3 Frizzard. Zane attacks Robert with Malcolm. Robert takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers. Zane creates a treasure, and in his second main phase, he casts Jeweled Lotus. With nothing else, he gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Robert with Narset, and Narset triggers. The table hangs on to the edge of their seat as Zach exiles Felwar Stone, Scalding Tarn, Polluted Delta, and Hall of the Bandit Lord, completely whiffing. Robert takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Felwar Stone. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Aminatu's Augury. In response, Robert casts Pyroblast, countering Augury. Zach gives the turn to Jacob. Jacob draws, not paying for tithe. He casts his commander, Rashmi, Eternity's Crafter. He ends the turn. During his draw step, Robert draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library. He pays 8 life, keeping them both. Tithe triggers 3 times, and Zach creates 3 treasures. In his main phase, Robert plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Najeela, the Blade Blossom. He passes. Zane draws, not paying for the tithe. He casts Lotus Petal. He moves to combat and attacks Robert with Malcolm. Robert takes the hit, and Malcolm triggers. Zane creates a treasure, and in his second main phase, he casts Birds of Paradise. Zane ends his turn. Zach draws and starts off his turn by tapping Ancient Tomb to cast Seagate Restoration. It resolves. Zach draws 2 cards and has no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards a Steam Vents. He moves to combat and attacks Robert with Narset. Narset triggers, exiling Silence, Narset's Reversal, Cavern of Souls, and Spell Snare. Robert takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Silence. He holds priority and casts Narset's Reversal, targeting Silence. Reversal resolves, bouncing Silence back to his hand and creating a copy of Silence. The copy resolves, and a little dismayed at his Narset triggers, Zach ends the turn. Jacob draws, not paying for tithe. He floats mana from Soul Ring and casts Dramatic Reversal. Rashmi triggers, revealing an island into his hand. Jacob untaps all of his non-land permanents. With nothing else, he ships the turn. Robert draws, not paying for tithe. He plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Nature's Will. In response, Jacob flashes in an Endurance and Rashmi triggers. Jacob holds priority and casts Brainstorm. In response, Robert casts Swansong targeting Brainstorm. Brainstorm is countered and Jacob creates a 2/2 bird. Rashmi's trigger resolves and Jacob reveals Fierce Guardianship, putting it into his hand. He casts it for its alternative cost, targeting Nature's Will. Will is countered and Endurance resolves. Endurance triggers targeting Zach. Zach puts his graveyard onto the bottom of his library, and with the stack clear, Robert moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Najeela. Najeela triggers, creating a 1/1 warrior tapped and attacking Zach. Zach takes the hit, and with his plans foiled, Robert passes the turn. At the end of Robert's turn, Zane casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Niv Mizzet Perun onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Zane. Zane draws, Tithe triggers, and Zach creates a treasure. Still in the draw step, Zach casts Silence, shutting off his opponents from casting spells this turn. Zane moves to combat and attacks Robert with Malcolm. Robert takes the hit and Malcolm triggers. Zane creates a treasure and he ends his turn. Zach draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Robert with Narset. Narset triggers, exiling Shatterskull Smashing, Walk the Aeons, Long-Term Plans, and Jessica's Will. Robert takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Jessica's Will targeting Robert. Will resolves. Zach adds 3 red and exiles Karn's Temporal Sundering, Brainstorm, and a Wooded Foothills. He plays Wooded Foothills. He casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 and put 2 back on top. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Waves of Aggression. Waves resolves, and Zach moves to his second combat step. He attacks Robert and Narset triggers. Zach holds priority and casts Long-Term Plans. He searches his library for a card and puts it third from the top. Narset's trigger resolves, exiling Exotic Orchard, Enter the Infinite, Lion's Eye Diamond, and a Soul Ring. Robert takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Soul Ring. He casts LED. He casts Enter the Infinite. Zach draws his library and puts a card from his hand on top of his library. He casts Walk the Aeons, taking an extra turn. He casts Scroll Rack. Zach doesn't discard to hand size due to Enter the Infinite, and he moves to his extra turn. Zach draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Zane with Narset. Narset triggers, and in response, Zach activates Scroll Rack, putting 2 cards from his hand on top of his library. Narset's trigger resolves, exiling Beacon of Tomorrows and Nexus of Fate. Zane takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Nexus of Fate. It resolves, shuffles into Zach's library, and Zach gets an extra turn. Zach casts Beacon of Tomorrows. Zach gains an extra turn, and it shuffles into Zach's library. He casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Endurance, and Jacob gains 3 life. Zach moves to his next turn. Zach draws and presents a loop of attacking with Narset, activating Scroll Rack, putting either Nexus of Fate or Beacon of Tomorrows on top of his library, exiling both, and casting them with Narset's ability. He takes infinite turns and attack steps, killing the table and winning the game.
Mike wins the Beta Booster Flip It or Rip It challenge and gets to start us off. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts Birds of Paradise. Mike passes. Matt draws a card for turn and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast a turn 1 Mystic Remora. Matt passes. Dan draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Llanowar Elves. He ships the turn to Tad. Tad draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He passes. Mike draws and casts Elves of Deep Shadow. He follows it up with an Esper Sentinel. All finished up, he gives the turn to Matt. During his upkeep, Matt taps his Mana Confluence to help pay for Mystic Remora. He draws and casts a Lotus Petal. Sentinel triggers and Mike draws. Upset that nobody fed his fish, Matt casts In the Festivities. It resolves and deals 1 damage to each opponent and wipes 5 creatures off of the board. Now, having taught everyone a lesson, Matt passes. Dan draws and plays a Savannah. He casts Finehorn Elves. He passes. Tad draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Tinderwall. Matt wonders just how many creatures his opponents will cast, and Tad gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand to help cast Rhystic Study. Remore triggers and Matt draws. Rhystic Study resolves and Mike ships the turn. During its upkeep, Matt lets his Mystic Remora die. He draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Springleaf Drum. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. All finished up, Matt passes. Dan draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts Survival of the Fittest, paying for Rhystic. He passes. Tad draws and plays a Bayou. He sacrifices his Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Rhystic triggers and Mike draw. Dockside enters and he creates 3 treasures. Tad ships the turn. Mike draws, looks at his hand with nothing to do, and passes. Matt draws and plays an island. He taps Mana Confluence to help cast Krark the Thumbless. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Matt passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Tad casts Nature's Claim, targeting Survival, paying for Rhystic. In response, Dan activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding Spellseeker. He fetches up a Drannith Magistrate into his hand. Survival is destroyed and Dan gains 4 life. The turn moves to Dan. Dan draws and slams down Drannith Magistrate, paying for Rhystic. He plays an Overgrown Tomb tapped and passes the turn. Tad draws and casts a Finehorn Elves, paying for Rhystic. Tad passes. At the end of Tad's turn, Mike casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It resolves and Tad chooses the Path of Chaos and doesn't crack his treasures. Dockside then creates 4 treasures. Mike follows it up with a Wishclaw Talisman. He passes. Matt draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast his own Dockside Extortionist. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Dockside resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Tad makes a deal with Mike. He will crack his treasures if Mike will crack his own. Mike accepts, and each of them sacrifice their treasures and float mana. Matt, feeling like he got the short end of the stick on that deal, creates 2 treasures. Matt attempts to move through phases, and in response, Mike uses his floating mana to help cast Fire Covenant, paying 11 life, targeting all of his opponent's creatures. In response, Tad uses his floating mana to help cast Abrupt Decay, targeting Wishclaw Talisman. Abrupt Decay resolves, and Wishclaw is destroyed. With Fire Covenant back on the stack, Matt casts Frantic Search. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Krark triggers, and Matt loses the flip, returning Frantic Search to his hand. Then Fire Covenant resolves, wiping most of the board. With the board reset, once again, Matt passes. Dan draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver, paying for Rhystic. Dan ships the turn to Tad. Tad draws and taps his City of Brass to help cast Grim Monolith, paying for Rhystic. All finished up, Tad passes. Mike draws and plays a Taiga. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He gives the turn to Matt. Matt draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Baral, Chief of Compliance. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Matt passes. Dan draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Tad with Timna. Tad takes it and Dan gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Dan pays 1 and draws 1 through Timna. He plays a Scalding Tarn for turn. He casts his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero, paying for Rhystic. Dan ships the turn to Tad. Tad draws and then taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Corvold, Fate-Cursed King. Rhystic triggers and Tad pays. Corvold enters and triggers. Tad sacrifices his Grim Monolith. Corvold triggers again, Tad draws, and then Corvold gets a +1/+1 counter. With nothing else, Tad passes. Mike draws and casts Professional Facebreaker. He attempts to move to combat, and in response, Matt casts Stern Dismissal, targeting Najeela. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. In response, Mike casts Dispel, targeting Stern Dismissal. Dismissal is countered, and Mike moves to combat. He attacks Dan with Najeela and Dockside. Najeela triggers, and Mike creates a 1/1 warrior, tapped and attacking Matt. Dan blocks Dockside with Thrasios, and everybody takes the rest. Professional Facebreaker triggers twice, and Mike creates 2 treasures. With nothing else, Mike ends his turn. Matt draws and taps the City of Brass to help cast Burgi, God of Storytelling. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Matt passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Dan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave into play tapped. Dan draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He takes no other actions and gives the turn to Tad. Tad draws and decides it's time to act. He casts Unearth, targeting his Dockside Extortionist, paying for Rhystic. The table knows this is bad news, and so Dan decides to dig. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1, and reveals an Animate Dead into his hand. Still in response, Mike cracks his treasures, floating mana. Unearth resolves, and Dockside enters, creating 2 treasures. Tad moves to combat and attacks Mike with Corvold. Corvold triggers, and Tad sacrifices his Overgrown Tomb, drawing a card and putting a counter on Corvold. Mike takes it, and in his second main phase, Tad taps his City of Brass to help cast Imperial Seal. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Tad fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He cracks a treasure and Corvold triggers. He draws and Corvold gets a counter. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. Corvold and Rhystic trigger. Mike draws off a Rhystic, and with the Corvold trigger still in the stack, Matt casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Culling the Weak. Bergie and Rhystic triggered. Mike draws and Matt adds a red. Culling the Weak is countered and Baral triggers. Matt draws and discards a card. With the stack cleared up, Tad casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Tad cracks a treasure to pay for Rhystic. Corvold triggers, he draws, and Corvold gets a counter. He plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, paying a life, and Corvold triggers again. He draws, and Corvold gets another counter. He fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Foiled in his attempt to win, Tad passes. At the end of Tad's turn, Dan casts Cyclonic Rift, paying for Rhystic, targeting Najeela. In response, Mike casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Cyclonic Rift. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Spire Garden. He wastes no time in casting Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Knowing this is game over, Dan casts Pact of Negation, targeting Derevi. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. In response, Mike casts Veil of Summer. It resolves and Mike draws. Pact resolves, but doesn't counter Derevi. Then Derevi resolves. It enters and taps down Bergie. Mike attempts to move to combat, and the table sees their end. Mike attacks Matt with everything. Najeela triggers 3 times, creating 3 warriors tapped and attacking Matt. Matt takes it all, and Derevi and Facebreaker trigger. Mike creates a treasure and untaps 4 lands with Derevi. He uses the rest of his Derevi triggers to tap down the rest of his opponent's creatures. Still in combat, he activates Najeela. He untaps all attacking creatures and then gains Trample, Lifelink, and Haste until the end of turn. He gains another combat. He presents a loop of attacking with his creatures, creating more and more warriors through Najeela, untapping his lands with Derevi, gaining treasures through Facebreaker, and activating Najeela again and again for infinite combat steps. He attacks his opponents until they are dead, and Mike wins the game. But Tad has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Overgrown Tomb. Matt draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts Bergie, God of Storytelling. He follows it up with a Jeweled Lotus. Bergie triggers and he adds a red. He cracks his Jeweled Lotus to cast his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Bergie triggers and he adds a red again. Krark resolves, and already sitting in a strong position, Matt passes the turn. Dan draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora. In response, Matt reveals his Don't Feed the Fish tattoo, points to it and says, "Do not make me tap the sign." The table laughs and Mystic Remora resolves. Dan follows it up with an Esper Sentinel. He passes. Tad draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Deathrite Shaman. Tad ends the turn. Mike draws and plays a Plateau. He casts Esper Sentinel. He passes. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an island. He casts his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. Bergie triggers and adds a red. Sakashima resolves and enters as a copy of Krark. He moves to combat and attacks Dan with Krark and Bergie. Dan takes it, and all finished up, Matt ships the turn to Dan. During his upkeep, Dan pays to keep his Remora. He draws, takes no other actions, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Tad activates his Deathrite Shaman, exiling a land from Matt's graveyard to help cast Vampiric Tutor. Both Espers and Mystic Remora trigger. Tad doesn't pay, and everyone draws. Tad then fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Tad draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Tad creates 4 treasures. He cracks 3 treasures to help cast Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. Remora triggers, and Dan draws. Eldritch resolves, and Tad fetches up an Eternal Witness onto the battlefield. It triggers and returns Dockside from his graveyard to his hand. All finished up, Tad passes. Mike draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Rite of Flame. Remora and Esper trigger, and Dan draws 2. Mike adds 2 red. He uses it to help cast his own Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and he creates 4 treasures. He cracks some of his treasures to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He cracks a treasure to help cast Ignoble Hierarch. He moves to combat and attacks Dan with Esper. Noble Hierarch's Exalted triggers, and Esper Sentinel gets +1/+1. Dan takes it, and Mike ends the turn. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Fiery Islet. He casts Spellseeker. Bergie triggers and adds a red. Spellseeker resolves, and he fetches up a Jataxian Probe into his hand. He pays 2 life to help cast Jataxian Probe. A lot of triggers happen. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, Remora, and both Esper Sentinels trigger. Matt pays for both Esper Sentinels, Dan draws off of Remora, he adds a red through Bergie, then with both Krark triggers on the stack, Dan casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting the original Gitaxian probe. Mike Sentinel triggers and he draws. The original probe is countered, and Matt finally flips for his Krark triggers. Matt wins one Krark flip, looking at Dan's hand and drawing a card. He loses the other Krark flip, but doesn't return Gitaxian probe because it's already been countered. He casts a Lotus Petal. Remora triggers and Dan draws. Bergie triggers and he adds a red. He taps his Fiery Islet to help cast Impulse. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora trigger. Dan draws off of Remora, he adds a red through Bergie, he then wins one Krark flip and loses one Krark flip. He copies Impulse, looking at the top 4, putting one into his hand and bottoming the rest. He then returns the original to his hand. He casts Mox Diamond. Remora triggers and Dan draws. Bergie triggers and he adds a red. It enters and Matt discards a land. He recasts Impulse. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora all trigger. Dan draws off of Remora, Matt adds a red through Bergie, and then he loses both flips, returning Impulse to his hand. He cracks his Lotus Petal to help cast Impulse for the 3rd time. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora all trigger again. With all the triggers on the stack, Tad casts Entomb. Both Espers and Remora trigger, and Tad doesn't pay for any of them. Tad then fetches up an Underworld Breach into his graveyard. Then Matt doesn't pay for Dan's Remora, and he draws. Bergie triggers, and Matt adds a red. Krark and Sakashima's triggers resolve, and Matt loses both flips again. The table cheers, Matt cries, and Impulse returns to hand. He casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Najeela. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora trigger again. Dan draws, and then Matt adds a red through Bergie. Krark and Sakashima's trigger resolve, and he loses them again. Matt curses the luck gods and our Lord and Savior Ken, and he casts Lightning Bolt again, targeting Dan this time. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora all trigger again. Dan draws, and Matt adds a red through Bergie. Then the Krarkashima triggers resolve and loses one flip, and then finally wins one flip. Dan takes 3 from Lightning Bolt, and the original is bounced to Matt's hand. He moves to combat and attacks Dan with Krark, Sakashima, and Bergie. Dan takes it, and in his second main phase, Matt casts Lightning Bolt again, targeting Dan. You might be asking, with what mana? Don't forget, Bergie says this mana persists through phases. Both Krarks, Bergie, and Remora trigger. Dan draws off of Remora, and then Matt adds a red through Bergie. Matt wins one Krark flip and loses the other. Dan takes 3 from Lightning Bolt, and the original is returned to his hand. He casts Lightning Bolt for what feels like the 600th time. Both Krarks, Bergie, and Remora trigger. Dan draws off of Remora, and Matt adds a red through Bergie. Matt wins one Krark flip and loses the other. Dan takes 3 from Lightning Bolt, and then the original is returned to Matt's hand. He repeats this process exactly 3 more times. Dan draws each time, and then on the last flip, Matt wins both flips. In total, Dan takes 9 damage from Lightning Bolt and draws 3 cards. With Lightning Bolt finally being in the graveyard, and then after sucking up all the turn equity in the universe, Matt passes the turn. During his upkeep, Dan lets his Remora die. Also during his upkeep, he casts Vampiric Tutor. Esper triggers, and Mike draws. Dan fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding City of Brass. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Entomb, fetching up an Auriok Salvagers and putting it into his graveyard. He casts Reanimate, returning Auriok Salvagers to the battlefield, losing 4 life. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. He uses this mana to activate Auriok Salvagers, returning LED to his hand. He presents a loop of activating Auriok Salvagers, returning LED to his hand, casting it, and then cracking it for 3 white. With each iteration, he nets 1 white. He then uses this mana now to cast, crack, and return LED, netting all other colors as well. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He uses some of his infinite mana to activate Thrasios to draw his library and put all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, triggers, and Dan wins the game. Ryan had the best My Little Pony collection and gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He follows it up with a turn 1 Rhystic Study. The table suddenly has to reevaluate their game plan, and Ryan follows it up with a Lion's Eye Diamond. He passes. Drake draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He ends the turn. Jordan draws and plays a Forest. He casts Ubenwald Tracker. Rhystic triggers, and Ryan draws. Tracker resolves, and Jordan ships the turn. Sean draws and plays the Yavimaya Coast. He holds open mana and gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Wheel of Fortune. In response, Drake casts Vampiric Tutor. Rhystic triggers, and Ryan draws. In response, Ryan casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Vampiric Tutor. Tutor is countered, and in response to Wheel, Sean taps his Yavimaya Coast to cast Opt. He scries 1, draws a card, and Wheel resolves. Each player discards their hand, including Drake discarding Ad Nauseam and Thassa's Oracle. Then each player draws 7, and Ryan ends his turn. Drake draws and casts Chrome Mox. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws. Mox enters and Drake imprints Fire Covenant. He casts a Brainstorm. Rhystic triggers and he pays. He draws 3 and then puts 2 back on top. He plays a Tropical Island for turn. He casts Deathrite Shaman. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws. The table begs him to stop feeding Ryan cards, and Shaman resolves. Drake passes the turn. Jordan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Finehorn Elves. Rhystic triggers and Jordan taps his Ancient Tomb to pay for it. With nothing else, Jordan gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and also plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Chrome Mox. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws. Mox enters and Sean imprints Dramatic Reversal. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast his commander, Toothy, Imaginary Friend. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws, adding to his massive hand. Sean ends the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Polluted Delta. He also casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Opposition Agent. He casts his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to Combat and attacks Drake with Crom. Drake takes it, and Ryan ships the turn. Drake draws and casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom, paying the Rhystic tax. He ends the turn. Jordan draws and casts Arbor Elf, tapping his Ancient Tomb to pay for Rhystic. He casts Worldly Tutor, paying for Rhystic again. Crom triggers and Ryan draws. He fetches up a Heron Blade Elite onto the top of his library. He plays a City of Brass and ships the turn. Sean draws and Toothy triggers, getting a +1/+1 counter. He plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast his other commander, Pure, Imaginative Rascal. Rhystic triggers and he pays. He gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Badlands. He casts Grim Monolith. He casts his other commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools. He activates Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. He follows it up with Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He keeps back blockers for Najeela and gives the turn to Drake. Drake draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Jordan with Najeela. Najeela triggers, creating a 1/1 warrior tapped and attacking Jordan. Jordan declares no blocks and takes it all. Drake ends the turn. Jordan draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Heron Blade Elite. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws. He uses his Arbor Elf to untap his Ancient Tomb, which now is a forest thanks to Yavimaya. He casts his commander, Ragadraga, Gorgut's Boss. Rhystic and Crom trigger and Ryan draws 2. Ragadraga enters and Heron Blade triggers, getting a +1/+1 counter. All through, Jordan passes. Sean draws and Toothy triggers, getting 2 +1/+1 counters. He plays an Emergent Zone for turn. He holds open mana and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Ragavan. Drake takes the hit and Ragavan triggers. Drake exiles Dark Ritual and Ryan creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Ryan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Mystical Tutor. In response, Sean pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Mystical Tutor, paying for Rhystic. In response, Ryan pays 2 life to cast his own Mental Misstep, targeting Mental Misstep. Misstep is countered, and Ryan fetches up an Ad Nauseam onto the top of his library. He activates Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing Crom and drawing 3 cards. To the surprise of the table, Ryan passes he slams down Ad Nauseam. In response, Drake casts Force of Will for its alternate cost, paying a life and exiling a blue card, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, Ryan casts Pyroblast, targeting Force of Will, countering it. With Ad Naus still in the stack, Drake casts Tainted Pact. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws. Drake exiles until he finds Mindbreak Trap, putting it into his hand. He casts Mindbreak Trap, targeting Ad Nauseam, paying for Rhystic. In response, Ryan casts Delay, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Mindbreak Trap is countered and exiled with 3 time counters on it. With the table nearly out of options, Sean and Drake start talking. They come up with a plan, albeit a desperate one, but a plan nonetheless. Sean casts Mystical Tutor, paying for Rhystic. He fetches up a Flusterstorm onto the top of his library. This now resets priority, and Drake responds by casting Deadly Rollick for its alternate cost, targeting Toothy. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws. Toothy is exiled and triggers. Sean draws 3 and then taps his Yavimaya Coast to cast Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Ad Nauseam. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws. With nothing else, and Ryan being able to stop 4 interaction pieces in one turn, Ad Naus is countered. Thwarted in his win attempt, Ryan passes. Drake draws and moves straight to combat. He swings Najeela and a warrior at Ryan. Najeela triggers and he creates 2 warriors tapped and attacking Ryan as well. Ryan takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Drake casts Mystic Remora. Rhystic triggers and Ryan draws. With nothing else, Drake ends the turn. Jordan draws and taps his Ancient Tomb, floating 2 mana. He activates Arbor Elf, untapping Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb again to cast Tooth and Nail. Ragadraga, Rhystic, and Remora all trigger. Drake draws, Jordan pays for Rhystic, and Ragadraga untaps Heron Blade, giving it +7/+7 and trample until the end of turn. Tooth and Nail resolves, and he fetches up an Allosaurus Shepherd and a Regal Force into his hand. He casts Allosaurus Shepherd, paying for Rhystic. He follows it up with Regal Forest. Ragadraga and Rhystic trigger. He pays for Rhystic, untapping Heron Blade and giving it another +7/+7 until the end of turn. Regal Force enters and he draws 7 cards. He taps the City of Brass, floating a red. He then casts Wave of Vitriol. Ragadraga, Rhystic, and Mystic all trigger. He pays for both and then untaps Heron Blade, giving it another +7/+7. In response, Sean floats a green. In response, Ryan casts Chain of Vapor, targeting his mana crypt. Remora triggers and Drake draws. Crypt bounces and he continues the chain, sacrificing a land to bounce Mox Diamond. He sacks another land, bouncing Grim Monolith. He sacks a land, bouncing his Chrome Mox. He sacks another land, bouncing his Lion's Eye Diamond. He sacrifices one last land, targeting Heron Blade with the chain. In response, Jordan casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Chain of Vapor. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and he pays for both. In response, Drake casts Final Fortune to try and draw Ryan into an answer. Ryan draws through Rhystic, doesn't find what he needs, and Final Fortune resolves, giving Drake an extra turn. Then Swat changes the target of Chain of Vapor to Regal Force, bouncing it. He declines to continue the chain. With Wave of Vitriol still on the stack, Sean casts Veil of Summer, not paying for either Rhystic or Mystic. He draws a card, then Drake floats a blue, and then Wave of Vitriol resolves. Each player sacrifices all artifacts, enchantments, and non-basic lands. Jordan fetches up a basic forest and mountain into play tapped, and then Sean fetches up a basic forest and island into play tapped. Next, Jordan casts Regal Force. Ragadraga triggers, untapping Heron Blade and giving it +7/+7. Regal Force enters and he draws 7 cards. He taps Heron Blade for 39 mana and casts Garruk, Primal Hunter. He activates Garruk's second ability, killing it and drawing 39 cards. He casts Void Winnower. Ragadraga triggers, untapping Heron Blade, giving it another +7/+7. He casts Platinum Angel. Ragadraga triggers, untapping Heron Blade and giving it another +7/+7. He casts Spine of Ish-Sa. Ragadraga triggers, untapping itself, giving it +7/+7 and trample. Spine of Ish-Sa enters and targets itself. In response, Ryan casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting the ability. In response, Jordan casts Bolt Bend, targeting Deflecting Swat. In response, Drake casts Swan Song, targeting Bolt Bend. In response, Jordan casts Veil of Summer. Veil resolves, Jordan draws a card, and Swan Song resolves but doesn't counter Bolt Bend. Jordan then creates a 2/2 bird, and then Bolt Bend changes the target of Deflecting Swat to Bolt Bend itself. Swat then fizzles, and Spine of Ish-Sa destroys itself. Spine triggers and returns itself to Jordan's hand. Jordan recasts Spine of Ish-Sa. Ragadraga triggers, untapping, pumping a creature, and giving it trample until the end of turn. When Spine enters, he has it destroy itself and then returns it to his hand. He presents a loop of casting Spine, triggering Ragadraga, having Spine kill itself, and returning it to his hand. He keeps doing this until his team is infinitely large. He then swings out at the table, killing everyone, and winning the game. Sean draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts an Arcane Signet. He passes. Jordan draws and plays the City of Brass. He also casts a Mana Crypt. He ends the turn. Drake draws and exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He taps it to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He ships the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools. He activates Tevish's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. He follows it up with a Mystic Remora. In response, Sean casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Time Twister onto the top of his library. Remora resolves, and Ryan, with a very good turn 1, passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, and in his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He casts Time Twister. Remora triggers, and Ryan draws. In response, Jordan taps his City of Brass to cast Tybalt's Trickery, targeting Time Twister. Remora triggers, and Ryan draws again. In response, Drake casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Tybalt's Trickery. Remora triggers, and Ryan draws. Force counters Trickery, and Twister resolves. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7. With nothing else, Sean passes. During his upkeep, Jordan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Spire Garden. He casts Llanowar Elves. He passes. Drake draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Najeela. Najeela triggers, creating a 1/1 warrior tapped and attacking Ryan. Ryan declares no blocks and takes the hit. In his second main phase, Drake taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Imperial Seal. Remora triggers, and Ryan draws. In response, Jordan taps the City of Brass to flash in an Aven Mind Sensor. Aven resolves, and Drake searches the top 4 of his library, puts 1 on top, and loses 2 life. With nothing else, Drake passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. Also in his upkeep, he pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He activates Tevish's second ability, sacrificing a Thrall, drawing 2 cards. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler. He casts a Mana Vault. Channeler triggers, and he surveils a snow-covered island into his graveyard. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Sean wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, and in his main phase, Urza Saga gets his final counter. He floats a mana and sacrifices it, searching the top 4 of his library, failing to find. He casts Wall of Roots. He casts Simic Signet. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. He activates Wall of Roots, adding a green. He casts his own Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Ryan draws again. Priority passes around the table and Sean's Mystic Remora resolves. Sean gives the turn to Jordan. During his upkeep, Jordan loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Horizon Canopy. Staring down 2 Remoras, he does nothing else and passes the turn. Drake draws and plays a Plateau. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with everything. Najeela triggers, creating 2 warriors tapped and attacking Ryan. Ryan blocks Najeela with a Thrall and takes the rest. Not wanting to feed the fish, Drake passes. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. Also in his upkeep, he pays for his Remora. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts his other commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. He activates Tevish's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Sean wins his mana crypt roll. Also in his upkeep, he pays for his Remora. He draws and casts his commander, Toothy, Imaginary Friend. He passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Jordan taps his Horizon Canopy to cast Court of Calling, where X equals 2. Both Remoras trigger and Ryan and Sean draw. Toothy triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Court resolves and Jordan fetches up a Devoted Druid onto the battlefield. Still in the end step, Jordan taps his City of Brass to cast Worldly Tutor. Both Remoras and Crom trigger. Ryan draws 2 and Sean draws 1. Toothy triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. In response, Sean pays 2 life to help cast Mental Misstep targeting Worldly Tutor. Remora and Crom trigger. Ryan draws 2 and then Misstep counters Worldly Tutor. The turn moves to Jordan. During his upkeep, Jordan wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. He casts Bala Ged Recovery targeting Worldly Tutor. Sean and Ryan draw and Toothy gets a +1/+1 counter. Worldly Tutor returns to Jordan's hand and he casts it. Both Remoras and Crom trigger. Ryan draws 2, Sean draws 1, and Toothy gets a +1/+1 counter. In response, Ryan casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Toothy gets another counter, and Worldly Tutor is countered and exiled. Jordan moves to combat and attacks Drake with Aven Mind Sensor. Drake takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Jordan activates Devoted Druid, putting a -1/-1 counter on it and untapping it. He taps his Horizon Canopy to help cast his commander, Rocco, Kappa Ready Caterer, where X equals 2. Rocco enters and he fetches up a Vizier of Remedies onto the battlefield. Now with Vizier on the battlefield, he can activate Devoted Druid without giving it a -1/-1 counter. He then generates infinite green mana. Next, he channels Boseiju, who endures, targeting Ryan's Mystic Remora. In response, Ryan casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Boseiju's ability. Remora triggers and Sean draws. Toothy triggers and gets a counter. Swat resolves, changing Boseiju's target to Sean's Mystic Remora. Sean's Remora is destroyed, and then he searches the top 4 of his library, failing to find. Jordan casts Manamorphose, paying for Remora. He adds 2 mana and draws a card. Unfortunately, he doesn't have what he needs to keep going and has to pass the turn. Drake draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He taps his Ancient Tomb and his Mana Confluence to cast Snap, targeting Aven Mind Sensor. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. Aven is bounced and Drake untaps 2 lands. He cracks his Windswept Heath, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Chrome Mox. Remora and Crom trigger. Ryan draws and Drake imprints Mental Misstep. Drake then casts Thassa's Oracle. Everyone perks up, and in response, Ryan casts Mystical Tutor. Channeler triggers and he surveils Talisman of Indulgence into his graveyard. Ryan then fetches up a Fierce Guardianship onto the top of his library. Thassa's Oracle then enters, triggers, and Drake passes priority. The table scratches their head a bit, and Oracle's ability resolves. Drake looks at the top 2 cards of his library, puts one on bottom and the other on top. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast Neoform, sacrificing Thassa's Oracle as an additional cost. Remora triggers and Ryan draws. The table now understands why he cast Oracle, and in response, Ryan casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Neoform. Channeler triggers, and in response, Drake casts Veil of Summer. Remora triggers, and Ryan draws. Out of answers, Veil resolves. Drake draws a card, and Ryan surveils Cyclonic Rift into his graveyard. Then Fierce resolves, but doesn't counter Neoform. Drake then fetches up Derevi, Imperial Tactician, onto the battlefield. Derevi triggers, tapping down Toothy. He moves to combat and attacks everything at Sean. Najeela triggers, creating 4 warriors tapped and attacking Sean. Sean blocks a warrior and then takes the rest. Derevi triggers 7 times. He untaps 5 of his lands, floating mana between triggers to activate Najeela. He untaps all of his attacking creatures, giving them trample, lifelink, and haste until the end of turn. He uses the last 2 Derevi triggers to tap down 2 of his opponent's creatures. Drake then presents a loop of attacking with all of his creatures, doubling his warriors, untapping his lands to activate Najeela over and over for infinite combat steps, and Drake wins the game. Drake wins the game of pickup sticks and gets to start us off. Drake draws a card for turn and plays a Marsh Flats. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He cracks his Marsh Flats, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring and passes the turn. Charles draws and plays the Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Portable Hull. It enters and exiles Drake's Soul Ring. Drake mumbles something about turn order, and Charles passes the turn. Noah draws and plays the Yavimaya Coast. He taps it to help cast Finehorn Elves. Noah ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Bountiful Promenade. He casts Deafening Silence. The table sinks a bit, and Nick gives the turn to Drake. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Nick with Najeela. Najeela triggers and creates a 1/1 warrior tapped and attacking Nick. Nick takes it, and in his second main phase, Drake plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Talisman of Curiosity. Drake ends his turn. Charles draws and plays the Snow-Covered Plains. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts an Academy Rector. The table takes notice, and Charles passes. Noah draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He casts Green Sun Zenith where X equals 2. He fetches up a Hermit Druid onto the battlefield and shuffles Green Suns back into his library. Noah passes. At the end of Noah's turn, Drake casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Nalasaurus Shepherd. He casts an Arbor Elf. Nick ends his turn. At the end of Nick's turn, Drake casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, exiling Noah's Hermit Druid. Drake draws and plays a Savannah. He taps his Talisman to help cast Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Everyone knows this spell's game over, but Derevi enters and untaps his Underground Sea. Drake then tells the table he's actually a mana short, so they don't need to worry. The table doesn't believe him, and Drake moves to combat. He attacks Noah with Najeela and a warrior. Najeela triggers and Drake creates 2 warriors tapped and attacking Nick. Both take it and Derevi triggers 4 times, untapping his Talisman and Savannah and tapping down Nick's Shepherd and Arbor Elf. Finished up, Drake gives the turn to Charles. During his draw step, Charles takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Mirage Mirror. Charles passes the turn. Noah draws and casts a Soul Ring. He taps his Yavimaya Coast to help cast Gilded Drake. It resolves and exchanges control of Drake's Najeela. He casts Boreal Druid and passes the turn. Nick draws and plays a Sacred Foundry into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Stony Silence. He casts Bloom Tender. Nick ends his turn. Drake draws and plays a Badlands. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with Gilded Drake and Derevi. Noah takes it, Derevi triggers, untapping both creatures. With nothing else, Drake passes to Charles. During his draw step, Charles takes the damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays an Ancient Den for turn. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Charles passes. Noah draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with Najeela. Najeela triggers, creating a 1/1 warrior, tapped and attacking Nick. Nick takes it, and in his second main phase, Noah cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Gralnock the Omnivore. Noah passes the turn. Nick draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and he fetches up a Sylvan Safekeeper into his hand. He casts Rest in Peace. It resolves and exiles all graveyards. He casts Sylvan Safekeeper. Finished up, Nick passes. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Noah with Derevi and Gilded Drake. Noah takes it and Derevi triggers. He untaps Savannah twice, floating a mana. He uses that mana to cast Eladamri's Call. He fetches up a Thassa's Oracle into his hand. Drake passes. At the end of Drake's turn, Charles activates Urza Saga, creating a construct. During his draw step, Charles takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats a mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Pithing Needle onto the battlefield. It enters, and Charles names Najeela. He casts Grasp of Fate. It enters and exiles Stony Silence, Talisman of Curiosity, and Gralnock. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with his construct. Drake takes 7, and Charles ends his turn. Noah draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat, attacking Charles with Najeela and Drake with a warrior. Najeela triggers, and Noah creates 2 warriors tapped and attacking Drake. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Noah casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Finehorn Elves as an additional cost. He fetches up a Spellseeker onto the battlefield. Spellseeker enters, and Noah fetches up a Cyclonic Rift into his hand. Finished up, Noah gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and casts his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Rebels. He casts Professional Facebreaker. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Ranger Captain. Charles takes it, and Facebreaker triggers. Nick creates a treasure, and then passes the turn to Drake. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Nick with Gilded Drake and Derevi. Nick takes it, and Derevi triggers, untapping Drake's creatures. Unfortunately locked out of doing much else, Drake passes the turn. During his draw step, Charles takes a damage from his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts On Thin Ice. It enters and exiles Derevi. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with his construct. Nick takes 7, and Charles ships the turn to Noah. Noah draws and moves to combat. He attacks Charles with Najeela. Najeela triggers, creating a warrior, tapped and attacking Nick. Nick blocks the warrior, and then Charles takes the hit. In his second main phase, Noah taps his Yavimaya Coast to recast his commander, Gralnock. Noah ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a command tower. He activates Facebreaker, sacrificing a treasure, exiling Fey Burrow Elder off of the top of his library. He He moves to combat, attacking Charles with Facebreaker and Drake with everything else. In response, Charles activates Mirage Mirror, having it become a copy of his construct. Then Drake blocks Ranger Captain with Gilded Drake and blocks Shepherd, Arbor Elf, and Bloom Tinder with his warriors. Charles blocks Facebreaker with Academy Rector and his construct. Before damage, Nick activates Allosaur Shepherd, pumping all of his elves. Then damage happens, multiple creatures die, including Ranger Captain and Academy Rector. Rector does not trigger due to Rest in Peace on the battlefield. Then Drake dies, Facebreaker triggers, and Nick creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Fey Burrow Elder. Finished up, Nick ends his turn. During his draw step, Charles takes a damage from his mana vault. In his main phase, he casts Cut a Deal. He holds priority and sacrifices his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. Then his opponents draw a card, and then Charles draws 2. He casts Eidolon of Rhetoric. He moves to combat and attacks Nick with his construct. Nick takes 6, and Charles gives the turn to Noah. Noah draws and casts a Mox Opal. He passes. Nick draws and plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Charles takes a damage from his mana vault. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with his construct. Noah blocks with a warrior. In his second main phase, Charles activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of Mana Vault. He casts his commander, Owl, the Dawn Sky. Charles passes to Noah. Noah draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Noah's turn, Nick flashes in an Aven Mind Sensor. Nick draws and casts Sarath, the Viper's Fang. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with everything. Charles blocks Jetmir with Owl and Allosaur Shepherd with Eidolon. Before damage, Nick activates Allosaur Shepherd, pumping his elves. Jetmir dies, and Charles dies. When Charles dies, his Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield and Nick's Stony Silence re-enters. Finished up, Nick gives the turn to Noah. Noah draws and casts Laboratory Maniac. Seeing the writing on the wall, Noah gives the turn back to Nick. Nick draws and casts the Kotley Honor Guard. He recasts his commander, Jetmir. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with everything. Noah takes it all, dies, and Nick wins the game. Drake had the best wall graffiti and gets to start us off. Drake draws a card for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. Drake passes. Cal draws a card for turn and plays a Swamp. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Pawn of Ulamog. Cal passes. Sean draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts a Birds of Paradise and ends his turn. Charles draws and plays a Plains. He casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Najeela. In response, Drake casts Swan Song. Swords is countered and Charles creates a 2/2 bird. Charles passes. During his upkeep, Drake casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He draws and plays a Plateau. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Najeela. Najeela triggers and Drake creates a 1/1 warrior tapped and attacking Cal. Cal takes it and Drake ends his turn. At the end of Drake's turn, Cal casts his own Vampiric Tutor. He also fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Cal. Cal draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts his commander, Yawgmoth, Grand Physician. Cal passes. Sean draws and starts off his turn by casting Lotus Cobra. He plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. Lotus Cobra triggers and Sean adds a green. He casts Collector Oof. Everyone is the big sad as Sean passes to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Plains. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with his bird. Drake takes it, and in his second main phase, Charles casts Winds of Abandon, targeting Najeela. Najeela is finally exiled, and Drake searches his library for a basic, failing to find. Charles ends his turn. Drake draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Derevi, Imperial Tactician. It enters and Drake untaps his command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with his warrior. Charles takes it, Derevi triggers, and Drake untaps his Underground Sea. Drake passes to Cal. During his upkeep, Cal loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions due to Collector Oof, and passes the turn. Sean draws and plays a Fiery Islet. Cobra triggers and Sean adds a blue. He taps his Fiery Islet to help cast his commander, Omnath, Locus of Creation. It enters and Sean draws. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Lotus Cobra. Charles takes it and Sean ends his turn. Charles draws and plays a Plains. He casts Weathered Wayfarer. He casts his commander, 8.5 Tails. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with his bird. Cal takes it and Charles ships the turn to Drake. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Charles with Derevi. Charles takes it, Derevi triggers, and Drake untaps Derevi. Drake ends his turn. During his upkeep, Cal wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Cal passes. Sean draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. Omnath triggers and Sean gains 4 life. Cobra triggers and he adds a green. He cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. Omnath triggers and Sean adds 4 mana. Cobra triggers and he adds a green. He casts Eternal Witness. It enters and Sean returns Misty Rainforest to his hand. He casts Growth Spiral. He draws a card and puts Misty Rainforest onto the battlefield. Omnath triggers and deals 4 to each opponent. Cobra triggers and adds a green. Sean casts Null Rod. Drake and Cal sink their heads as Sean gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and activates Weathered Wayfarer. In response, Sean cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. Omnath triggers and Sean gains 4. Cobra triggers and adds a blue. Then Charles fetches up an Urza Saga into his hand. He plays an Urza Saga for turn, getting its first counter. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with his bird. Sean takes it and Charles passes the turn. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Sean with Derevi. Sean takes it, Derevi triggers, and Drake untaps Derevi. Still locked out of the game, Drake passes. During his upkeep, Cal wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and, also still locked out of the game, takes no actions and passes. Sean draws, takes no actions, and passes. Charles draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He activates Weathered Wayfarer, fetching up an Ancient Tomb into his hand. He plays an Ancient Tomb for turn. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Wandering Archaic. In response, Drake casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Archaic. Charles moves to combat and attacks Sean with his bird. Sean takes it, and Charles gives the turn to Drake. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Sean with Derevi. Sean takes it, Derevi triggers, and Drake untaps Derevi. With nothing else to do, Drake passes. During his upkeep, Cal wins his mana crypt roll. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Cal's turn, Sean casts Intuition. He fetches up a Life from the Loam, Beseju Who Endures, and a Cephalid Coliseum. Cal gives him Coliseum. Sean moves to his turn. During his draw step, Sean dredges Life from the Loam back to his hand. He plays a Cephalid Coliseum for turn. Omnath triggers, and Sean gains 4 life. Cobra triggers and adds a blue. He cracks his Coliseum, drawing 3 and discarding 3, including Life from the Loam. He taps his Fiery Islet to help cast Green Sun Zenith, where X equals 5. The table deliberates a bit, but decide to let it resolve. Sean then fetches up a Titania, Protector of Argoth, onto the battlefield, shuffling Green Suns back into his library. The table didn't expect that creature to hit the battlefield, and Titania triggers. Sean returns Misty Rainforest to the battlefield. Omnath triggers, and Sean adds 4 mana. Cobra triggers and adds a green. Sean casts Sylvan Library. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Omnath. Drake blocks with the Warrior, and Sean ends his turn. Charles draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. In response, Charles taps his Ancient Tomb to activate Saga, creating a construct. He then sacrifices Saga, fetching up a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He plays the Flagstones of Trocaire for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with his bird. Sean takes it, and Charles passes the turn. Drake draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts Culling Ritual. In response, Charles activates Weathered Wayfarer, fetching up a War Room into his hand. Still in response, Sean cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. Omnath triggers, and Sean gains 4 life. Cobra triggers and adds a white. Titania triggers, and Sean creates an Elemental. Still in response to Ritual, Sean casts Silence. Drake sighs, and Silence resolves. Then Culling Ritual resolves, destroying all non-land permanents mana value 2 or less, and then Drake adds 14 mana. Unfortunately, he cannot do anything with it, so Drake moves to combat. He attacks Sean with Derevi. Sean takes it, Derevi triggers, and Drake untaps Derevi. Finished up, Drake passes to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Swamp. He passes. During his draw step, Sean dredges Life from the Loam back to his hand. In his main phase, he casts Life from the Loam, returning Windswept Heath, Misty Rainforest, and Cephalid Coliseum to his hand. He plays a Windswept Heath for turn. Omnath triggers, and Sean gains 4 life. He cracks his Windswept Heath, pays a life, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. Omnath triggers, and Sean adds 4 mana. Titania triggers, and Sean creates an Elemental. Next, Sean cracks his Fiery Islet to draw a card. Titania triggers, and Sean creates an Elemental. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Titania and Charles with Omnath. They both take it, and Sean passes the turn. Charles draws and plays a Plains. He casts Grasp of Fate. It enters, and he exiles Drake's Derevi and Sean's Omnath. He intentionally leaves Yawgmoth with the agreement that Cal should use it to help get some of Sean's creatures off the board. Next, Charles taps his Ancient Tomb to help recast his commander, 8.5 Tails. Charles gives the turn to Drake. Drake draws and casts Ad Nauseam. Ad Naus resolves, and Drake reveals a Cabal Ritual, Flusterstorm, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Diabolic Intent, Forbidden Orchard, Brain Freeze, Spire of Industry, Veil of Summer, Volcanic Island, Demonic Consultation, Badlands, Fierce Guardianship, Gamble, Deadly Rollick, Silence, Imperial Seal, Worldly Tutor, and Heuristic Study, taking him to 1 and deciding to stop there. This was an unfortunate Ad Naus since he basically got no fast mana to kick off his pile, so he thinks for a second and decides what his line should be. Drake plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. City of Traders triggers, and he sacrifices it. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Spire of Industry. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Flusterstorm. Drake casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He taps his Forbidden Orchard, giving Charles the Spirit to cast Demonic Consultation. He holds priority and sacrifices his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 red. Consultation resolves, and Drake names Underworld Breach. He begins to flip the first 6, and Underworld Breach was the first card. So unfortunately, Drake exiles his entire library. Now, completely out of the game, Drake passes. Cal draws and casts Cult Conscript. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Yawgmoth. Drake takes it and dies. In his second main phase, Cal activates Yawgmoth, paying a life, sacrificing Cult Conscript, putting a -1/-1 counter onto Titania, and drawing a card. He plays a Phyrexian Tower for turn. Cal ends his turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Sean casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Green Sun Zenith onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Cephalid Colosseum. He cracks it, drawing 3 and discarding 3. Titania triggers and Sean creates an Elemental. He casts Green Sun Zenith where X equals 1. He fetches up a Sylvan Safekeeper onto the battlefield, shuffling Green Suns back into his library. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Titania and 2 Elementals and Cal with Eternal Witness. Charles blocks Titania with 8.5 tails. Before damage, Sean activates Sylvan Safekeeper, sacrificing 3 lands, giving his Elemental Shroud until the end of turn. Titania triggers 3 times, and Sean creates 3 Elementals. Then they all take it, and Titania dies. Sean gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a War Room. He casts Sword of Feast and Famine. He equips the sword to his spirit. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with his spirit. Sean takes it, and Swords triggers. In response, Charles taps his Ancient Tomb and floats mana. Then Sword's ability resolves, Sean discards a card, and Charles untaps his lands. Before mana fades, Charles pays a life to activate War Room, drawing a card. In his second main phase, Charles casts Ambitious Farmhand. It enters, and Charles fetches up a Plains into his hand. Charles passes. Cal draws, takes no actions, and passes. Sean draws and moves to combat. He attacks Charles with everything. Charles blocks an Elemental with Farmhand. Before damage, Charles casts Unexpectedly Absent, targeting another Elemental, putting the token on top of Sean's library, making it cease to exist. Then Charles takes the rest and dies. When Charles dies, Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield. Sean's Omnath re-enters, triggers, and Sean draws a card. Sean passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Cal flashes in, an Opposition Agent. Cal draws and activates Yawgmoth, paying a life, sacrificing Opposition Agent, giving Sylvan Safekeeper a -1/-1 counter, and drawing a card. He plays a Swamp for turn. He activates Cult Conscript, returning it to the battlefield. He activates Yawgmoth, pays a life, sacrificing Cult Conscript, giving Eternal Witness a -1/-1 counter, and drawing a card. Seeing the writing on the wall, Cal passes. Sean draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. Omnath triggers and Sean gains 4 life. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with everything. Cal dies, and Sean wins the game. Drake's name showed up in the most magic lore, so he gets to start us off. Drake draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch and ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Homeward Path. He passes. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Portable Hole. It enters and exiles Drake's Ignoble Hierarch. Charles gives the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Talisman of Indulgence. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast an Elvish Mystic. With an excellent turn 1 setup, Ashani passes to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Crystal Vein as his land for turn. Punished from a mulligan to 4, he gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He passes. At the end of Charles' turn, Ashani taps his Talisman to cast a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Still in the end step, Charles channels Touch the Spirit Realm, targeting Ashani's Mana Crypt. Touch resolves, Crypt exiles, and the turn moves to Ashani. Ashani draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Underworld Breach. He sacrifices his Jeweled Lotus, adding 3 red. He sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. He casts his commander, Corvold, Fakehurst King. Corvold enters and he sacrifices Elvish Mystic. Corvold triggers, gets a +1/+1 counter, and Ashani draws a card. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He sacrifices LED, adding 3 green. Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. He casts Defense Grid. In response, Drake taps his Tarnished Citadel to help cast Eladamri's Call. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand, then Defense Grid resolves. Ashani moves to his end step, Mana Crypt re-enters, and he sacrifices Underworld Breach. Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. The turn moves to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Drake creates 4 treasures. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. He adds 4 black. He follows up with an Intuition. He fetches up an Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and a Savine's Reclamation. Charles gives him LED. Drake casts Mox Amber. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Underworld Breach. Breach enters, Savine's copies, and Drake returns Dockside Extortionist to the battlefield. Dockside enters and Drake creates 4 more treasures. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He sacrifices his LED, discards his hand, adding 3 blue. He escapes Intuition. He fetches up a Brain Freeze, Final Fortune, and a Derevi Imperial Tactician. Charles gives him Derevi. Drake escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling some of his library. He escapes Brain Freeze again, milling the rest of his library. Drake escapes LED and then cracks it for 3 blue. Drake escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, triggers, and Drake wins the game. Ashani draws and plays a command tower. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch and passes the turn to Charles. Charles draws, plays a Snow-Covered Plains, and ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Mana Vault. He ships the turn to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Bayou. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it to help cast his commander, Corval, Fey-Cursed King. Corval enters and Ashani sacrifices Ignoble Hierarch. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. With nothing else, Ashani passes. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Durannith Magistrate. He gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Phyrexian Tower. He casts Buried Alive. He fetches up a Villas, Broker of Blood, Blood Celebrant, and a Flesh Writher into his graveyard. All set, he ends his turn. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Ragavan. Peter takes it, Ragavan triggers, Peter exiles Asmodeus the Archfiend, and Drake creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Drake plays a Tundra. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger enters, and Drake fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. Drake ships the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it and pays a life. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Then Ashani fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Holding up mana, he passes to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Peter takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He plays a Swamp for turn. He casts Reanimate, targeting Villas, Broker of Blood. Reanimate resolves, and Peter loses 8 life. Villas triggers, and in response, Peter pays 2 life to activate Villas, targeting Spirit of the Labyrinth. Villas triggers again, but he cannot draw due to Spirit. Then Spirit dies, and the original Villas trigger resolves, and Peter draws 8 cards. Peter casts Lotus Petal. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Swamp. He casts Dance of the Dead, targeting Blood Celebrant. In response, Drake casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Dance of the Dead. Plans thwarted, Peter passes, discarding to hand size. Drake draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Ranger Captain. Charles takes it, and in his second main phase, Drake casts an Esper Sentinel. He ends the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 4 treasures. Ashani cracks his Marsh Flats and pays a life. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Then Ashani fetches up an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Corval. Corval triggers, and he sacrifices Dockside. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Drake takes 8, and in his second main phase, Ashani cracks a treasure, triggering Corval. After some deliberation among the table, Drake decides to sacrifice his Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Then Corval's trigger resolves, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Ashani casts his own Ragavan. Locked out of non-creature spells and unable to continue, Ashani passes. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts an Academy Rector. The table stands to attention, and Charles gives the turn to Peter. During his draw step, Peter takes a damage from his Mana Vault. Villas triggers, and Peter draws. In his main phase, he casts Animate Dead, targeting Blood Celebrant. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Peter pays. In response, Ashani cracks 2 treasures and floats mana. Corval triggers twice, getting 2 counters, and Ashani draws 2 cards. Unfortunately, not finding any answers, Animate Dead resolves, putting Blood Celebrant onto the battlefield. Peter activates Celebrant, paying a life and adding a black. Villas triggers, and Peter draws. Peter activates Celebrant 9 more times, losing 9 life and drawing 9 cards through Villas. He plays a Swamp for turn. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He activates Blood Celebrant 6 more times, losing 6 life and drawing 6 more cards through Villas. Peter casts Sacrifice, sacrificing Villas as an additional cost. He adds 8 black. He casts Grim Monolith. He casts a Defense Grid. In response, Ashani cracks a treasure. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Then, unfortunately for the team, Defense Grid resolves. Peter casts Sheoldred the Apocalypse. He casts Shallow Grave, returning Villas from his graveyard to the battlefield. Peter activates Blood Celebrant, paying a life, adding a black, and drawing through Villas. Sheoldred triggers, and Peter gains 2 life. Peter presents a loop of paying life with Blood Celebrant, drawing a card with Villas, and gaining 2 life through Sheoldred. With this loop, he draws through his deck. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Grim Tutor. He casts Cabal Ritual, adding 5 black. He casts Professor Onyx. He follows up by casting Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Professor Onyx triggers, each opponent loses 2, and Peter gains 2. Chain of Smog resolves, Peter discards 2, and he copies Chain of Smog, targeting himself again. He presents a loop of copying Chain of Smog, triggering Professor Onyx each time to drain the table. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game.
Alex was the last man standing at the water balloon battle and gets to start us off. But Mike has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns into play with a luck counter, exiling Mox Diamond. Alex draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe targeting Mike. He looks at Mike's hand and draws a card. He cracks his Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts Llanowar Elves. Alex ships the turn. Mike draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow. He passes. Kyle draws and plays a Savannah. He casts Esper Sentinel. He ends the turn. Zach draws and plays a Taika. He casts Soul Ring. Sentinel triggers and Kyle draws. He casts Felwar Stone. He follows it up with a Birds of Paradise. With a blazing fast start, Zach gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and casts Demonic Tutor. Sentinel triggers and Kyle draws. Alex fetches up a card into his hand and plays an Exotic Orchard. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays an Exotic Orchard of his own. He casts Smothering Tithe. Sentinel triggers and Kyle draws. Tithe resolves, and with nothing else, Mike gives the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws and Mike's Smothering Tithe triggers. Mike creates a treasure, and in his first main phase, Kyle plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and moves to combat. He attacks Alex with Sentinel. Alex takes the hit, and Kyle ends the turn, discarding to hand size. Zach draws, Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. In his main phase, Zach plays an island. He casts Nature's Lore. Sentinel triggers and Kyle draws. Tithe triggers and Mike creates a treasure. Zach searches his library for a tropical island, putting it into play. He casts his commander, Paco, Arcane Retriever. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Paco. Paco triggers, exiling Mystical Tutor, Fierce Guardianship, Verdant Catacombs, and a Mana Crypt. Paco gets 4 +1/+1 counters and Alex takes the hit. All finished up, Zach passes to Alex. Alex draws, Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. In his main phase, Alex casts Jeweled Lotus. Sentinel triggers and Kyle draws, Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Yorick, the Desecrated. He ends the turn. Mike draws and starts his turn off by casting Fey Burrow Elder. He taps his elves to cast Malevolent Hermit. With nothing else, Mike gives the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws, Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. In his main phase, Kyle plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He casts Gilded Drake. Drake resolves and exchanges control with Zach's Paco. Kyle passes the turn. Zach draws, Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. In his main phase, he plays a Spire Garden. He casts his other commander, Halden, Avid Arcanist. He casts Jiraga Tree Speaker. He casts Finhorn Elves. He casts Mana Crypt from exile through Halden's ability. Sentinel triggers, and Kyle draws. Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. Zach moves to combat and attacks Alex with Gilded Drake. Alex takes the hit, and Zach gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws, Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. In his main phase, Alex casts Cloud of Fairies. It enters and triggers twice due to Yorick. He untaps his Bayou and Exotic Orchard. Alex floats a blue and a green mana, then untaps his lands again. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Gilded Drake. Drake triggers and exchanges control with Paco again. He follows up with a Root Maze, paying for Sentinel. All finished up, Alex passes the turn. Mike draws and casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Kyle with Fey Burrow Elder. Kyle takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Timna triggers. Mike pays a life and draws a card. He plays a Savannah, tapped through Root Maze. He casts his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He gives the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws, Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. In his main phase, Kyle plays a tropical island, tapped through Root Maze. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Kyle casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Mike sacrifices his Malevolent Hermit, targeting Demonic Consultation. In response, Kyle casts Veil of Summer. In response, Mike activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Swords to Plowshares into his hand. Still in response to the consultation, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Demonic Consultation. Sentinel triggers, and Kyle draws. In response, Kyle casts Pact of Negation, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Priority passes around the table and gets to Mike. Mike says he's going to pass, and Zach asks why he isn't even going to activate Thrasios to find anything, something. They go back and forth about this for a little bit, and then the stack finally starts to clear. attack counters fierce, and Vale resolves with Kyle drawing a card. While Mike and Zach were talking, Kyle realized that if one of his opponents could trigger his Sentinel with his library empty, he would lose the game. So he decides to change up his line of play and name Snap as Consultation resolves. Kyle exiles the top 6 cards of his library and then keeps going until he finds a Snap. He puts it into his hand and Thassa's Oracle trigger resolves. He looks at the top 3 cards of his library, puts one on top and the rest on the bottom of his library. With a massive bullet dodge, Kyle ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his mana crypt roll. Still in his upkeep, Zach casts Mystical Tutor. Sentinel triggers and Kyle draws. Tithe triggers and Mike creates a treasure. Zach fetches up a Winds of Rebuke onto the top of his library. He draws. Tithe triggers and he pays. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Drake. Alex blocks with Cloud of Fairies, and in his second main phase, Zach levels up his Jiraga Tree Speaker. With nothing else, Zach passes. Alex draws. Tithe triggers and Mike creates a treasure. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Paco. Paco triggers, exiling a Soul Ring, Imperial Seal, Noxious Revival, and an Assassin's Trophy. Paco gets 4 +1/+1 counters, and Mike takes the hit. In his second main phase, Alex casts Reanimate, targeting Malevolent Hermit. Sentinel triggers, and Kyle draws. Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. Reanimate resolves. Hermit enters under Alex's control, and he loses 2 life. Alex ends the turn. During Alex's end step, Mike casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Paco. Sentinel triggers, and Kyle draws. Tithe triggers, and Mike creates a treasure. Paco is exiled, and Alex gains 11 life. Still in the end step, Mike casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Still in the end step, Zach casts Winds of Rebuke, targeting Fabro Elder. Sentinel triggers, and Kyle draws. Tithe trigger, and Mike creates a treasure. In response, Mike activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing Windfall into his hand. Elder bounces to Mike's hand and everyone mills 2 cards. The turn finally moves to Mike. Mike draws and starts off his turn by casting Notion Thief. He follows it up with a Windfall. Sentinel triggers and Mike steals the draw with Notion Thief. In response, Alex casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Notion Thief. Sentinel triggers and Mike steals the draw. Thief bounces to Mike's hand, and in response to Windfall, Mike casts Notion Thief. It resolves, and with the table out of answers, Windfall resolves. Everyone discards their hand, and Mike draws 40 cards. He casts Nature's Claim, destroying Root Maze, and Alex gains 4 life. He plays a Gaia's Cradle. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Chrome Mox. It enters, and Mike imprints Dranith Magistrate. He casts Auriok Salvagers. Mike cracks his LED, discarding his hand and adding 3 white. He activates Auriok Salvagers, returning LED to his hand. He casts LED. Mike then presents a loop of cracking LED for 3, returning it to his hand with Salvagers, recasting LED, generating 1 mana every time. He repeats this over and over, generating infinite mana. He activates Thrasios to draw his deck. He casts Noxious Revival, targeting Thassa's Oracle in his graveyard. Mike puts Thassa's Oracle on top of his library and activates Thrasios. He draws Oracle and casts it. Oracle enters. It triggers, and with no cards left in his library, Mike wins the game.
Zach survived the last dab challenge and gets to start us off. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Tundra. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Morphic Pool. He casts Dranith Magistrate. The table groans, and Zach passes the turn. Sinusky draws for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Lotus Petal. Well situated, Sinusky ends his turn. Zane draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Lotus Petal. Remora triggers and Sinusky draws. Zane ships the turn. Memo draws a card for turn and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora of his own. Remora triggers and Sinusky draws. Memo casts Rograx, Son of Roga. Sinusky and Zane stare at their own Rograx, locked out by Dranith Magistrate, and shake their heads at the irony. All through, Memo sends the turn to Zach. Zach draws and casts a Chrome Mox. Both Remoras trigger, and Memo and Sinusky draw. It resolves, and Zach imprints Pact of Negation. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Zane with Dranith Magistrate. Zane takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Timna. Finished up, Zach passes the turn. During his upkeep, Sanuski pays for his Mystic Remora. Also in his upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. Zane draws and plays an Underground Sea. With no further actions, he ends his turn. During his upkeep, Memo pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire as his land for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Sanuski draws. Memo casts Talisman of Progress. Remora triggers and Sanuski draws again. All finished, Memo passes the turn. Zach draws and heads straight to combat. He attacks Sanuski with Tymna and Zane with Draneth. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He plays a Wooded Foothills as his land for turn. He casts Counterbalance. Both Remoras trigger and Memo and Sanuski draw. Then Counterbalance resolves. Finished up, Zach passes to Sanuski. During his upkeep, Sanuski pays for his Remora. Also in his upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Talisman of Dominance. Remora and Counterbalance trigger. Zach reveals a Flooded Strand off of the top of his library through Counterbalance, and then Memo draws a card through Remora. Then Talisman resolves. All through, Sanuski ends his turn. Zane draws and plays a Volcanic Island. With no further actions, once again, he passes to Memo. During Memo's upkeep, his Remora triggers. In response, he casts Worldly Tutor, Counterbalance, and Remora trigger. Sanuski draws, then Zach declines to reveal through Counterbalance. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Memo fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. He then pays for his Remora. He draws for turn and then plays a Plateau. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Counterbalance triggers, and in response, Zach sacrifices his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He reveals a Ragavan Nimble Pilferer through Counterbalance, then Dockside resolves. It enters, and Memo creates 8 treasures. Memo ends his turn. Zach draws for turn and then dashes in Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He moves to combat and attacks Zane with Tymna and Sanuski with Ragavan. Both declare no blocks, Ragavan triggers, Zach creates a treasure, and Sanuski exiles Rhystic Study off of the top of his library. In his second main phase, Zach pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He plays a City of Traders as his land for turn. He casts Sanuski's Rhystic Study from exile. Both Remoras trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. In response, Sanuski casts Swan Song, targeting Rhystic Study. Remora and Counterbalance trigger. Zach reveals a Dark Ritual off of the top of his library, countering Swan Song. Then Memo draws through Remora. With Rhystic still in the stack, Memo flashes in an Archivist of Ogma. It resolves, and with Rhystic still in the stack, Zane hard casts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Rhystic. Both Remoras and Counterbalance trigger, and in response, Zach casts a Swan Song of his own, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Both Remoras trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. In response, Memo casts Eladamri's Call. Remora triggers, and Sanuski draws. Eladamri's Call resolves, and Memo fetches up a Grim Hireling into his hand. Then Swan Song counters Fierce Guardianship, and Zane creates a 2/2 bird. Then the Remora triggers resolve, and Memo and Sanuski draw. Finally, Rhystic Study resolves. Zach moves to his end step, and Ragavan returns to Zach's hand. The turn moves to Sanuski. During his upkeep, Sanuski pays for his Remora. He also loses his Mana Crypt flip, taking 3 damage. He draws and plays a Badlands. He casts Talisman of Indulgence. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic all trigger. Zach draws through Rhystic, then reveals an Underworld Breach off the top of his library through Counterbalance, countering Talisman. Then Memo draws through Remora. Next, Sanuski casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. Rhystic and Counterbalance trigger, Zach draws through Rhystic, then reveals Rhystic Study off of the top of his library. Then Ragavan resolves. Sanuski casts Mox Amber. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic all trigger again. Zach draws through Rhystic, then reveals a Talisman of Creativity through Counterbalance, then Memo draws through Remora, then the Mox Amber resolves. Sanuski passes, discarding to hand size. Zane draws and casts Time Twister. Remora, Rhystic, Counterbalance, and Remora all trigger. Sanuski draws through Remora, Zach draws through Rhystic, then chooses not to reveal through Counterbalance, and then Memo draws through Remora. With Time Twister still in the stack, Memo casts Veil of Summer. Rhystic, Counterbalance, and Remora trigger, Sanuski draws through Remora, Zach reveals Mox Opal through Counterbalance, and then draws through Rhystic. In response to Time Twister, Sanuski casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Veil of Summer. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic trigger, Zach draws, doesn't reveal through Counterbalance, and Memo draws through Remora. In response, Memo casts Swan Song, targeting Force of Negation. Counterbalance, Rhystic, and Remora trigger. Sanuski draws, Zach draws, then reveals a Toxic Deluge through Counterbalance. In response, Sanuski casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Swan Song. Remora, Counterbalance, and Rhystic trigger, Zach draws, chooses not to reveal through Counterbalance, and then Memo draws. Finally, with nothing else, Red Blast counters Swan Song, and Force of Negation counters and exiles Veil of Summer. With Time Twister still in the stack, Sanuski exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, floating a red. Then Time Twister resolves, everyone shuffles their hands and graveyards into their libraries, and then draws 7. Next, Zane plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He attempts to move through phases, and in response, Sanuski uses his floating red to cast Red Elemental Blast, targeting Counterbalance. Remora, Rhystic, and Counterbalance all trigger. Zach reveals a Watery Grave through Counterbalance, Zach draws through Rhystic, and then Memo draws through Remora. Then Red Elemental Blast resolves and counterbalance is destroyed. All through, Zane passes to Memo. During Memo's upkeep, his Remora triggers. In response, he casts Mystical Tutor. Sanuski's Remora triggers and he draws. Tutor resolves and Memo fetches up a Tainted Pact onto the top of his library. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand to help pay for Remora. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Ball. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zack draw. Memo casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zack draw again. Evolution resolves, and Memo fetches up a Thassa's Oracle onto the battlefield. Oracle triggers, and holding priority, Memo casts Tainted Pact. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zack draw. In response, Sanuski casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a Brain Freeze, targeting Tainted Pact. Rhystic and Remora trigger, and Zack and Memo draw. In response, Memo hard casts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Force of Negation. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zack draw again. In response, Sanuski casts Daze for its alternate cost, bouncing Underground Sea back to his hand, targeting Fierce Guardianship. Rhystic and Remora trigger, and Zack and Memo draw. Unfortunately tapped up, Memo has no response. Daze counters Fierce Guardianship, then Force of Negation counters and exiles Tainted Pact. Then Oracle's trigger resolves, and Memo looks at the top 3 cards of his library, leaving one on top and bottoming the rest. Plans thwarted, Memo passes the turn. At the end of Memo's turn, Zack casts Brainstorm. Both Remora triggers, and Sanuski and Memo draw. Then Brainstorm resolves, and Zack draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. The turn moves to Zack. Zack draws and casts Grim Tutor. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. Then Zack fetches up a card into his hand and loses 3 life. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and Memo draws a card and gains a life. Zack plays a Command Tower as his land for turn. City of Traders triggers, and he sacrifices it. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Memo casts Force of Whale for its alternate cost, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Dockside. Remora and Rhystic trigger, and Sanuski and Zack draw. Then Force resolves, countering Dockside. Next, Zack casts Mystic Remora. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. Then Remora resolves. He casts a Mana Ball. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw again. He casts a Lotus Petal, and Memo and Sanuski draw. Zack casts Time Twister. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. In response, Sanuski casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Time Twister. Both Remora's and Rhystic trigger, Memo draws 1, and Zack draws 2. Then Flusterstorm resolves, countering Time Twister. Zack casts a Felwar Stone. Both Remora's trigger, and Memo and Sanuski draw. He casts an Esper Sentinel. With nothing else, Zack passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Sanuski's Remora and Mana Crypt trigger. He wins his Mana Crypt roll, and with a Remora trigger still in the stack, he casts Vampiric Tutor. Remora, Rhystic, Esper Sentinel, and Remora all trigger. Zack draws 3, and Memo draws 1. Vampiric Tutor resolves, and Sanuski fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then he lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Gemstone Mine. He casts Demonic Tutor. Both Rhystics and Remora trigger, Zack draws 2, and Memo draws 1. Then Demonic resolves, and Sanuski fetches up a card into his hand. He casts a Mana Vault. Remora's and Rhystic trigger, Zack draws 2, and Memo draws 1. Sanuski casts Defense Grid, paying for Rhystic. Both Remora's trigger, and Zack and Memo draw. In response, Zack casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Defense Grid. Remora triggers, and Memo draws. Force resolves, countering and exiling Defense Grid. Next, Sanuski casts Rite of Flame. Rhystic and Remora's trigger, Zack draws 2, and Memo draws 1. Rite resolves, and Sanuski adds 2 red. He casts Dark Ritual, Zack draws 2, and Memo draws 1. Then Ritual resolves, and Sanuski adds 3 black. He casts Birgi, God of Storytelling. Zack's Rhystic triggers, and he draws. Then Birgi resolves. Sanuski casts Mox Opal. Birgi, Remora, Rhystic, and Remora all trigger. Zack draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Sanuski adds a red through Birgi. Then Opal resolves. Sanuski casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Ragavan as an additional cost. Zack draws 2, Memo draws 1, and then Sanuski adds a red through Birgi. Then Culling the Weak resolves, and he adds 4 black. Sanuski casts Juska's Will. Zack draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Sanuski adds a red through Birgi. Then Will resolves, and Sanuski exiles a Mystical Tutor, Crystal Vein, and a Mnemonic Betrayal. Sanuski follows it up by casting a Windfall. Zack draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Sanuski adds a red through Birgi. In response, Zack casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Windfall. Memo's Remora triggers, and in response, Sanuski casts Tainted Pact. Zack draws 2, Memo draws 1, and then Sanuski adds a red through Birgi. Then Tainted Pact resolves. He exiles until he finds a Chain of Vapor and puts it into his hand. Then the other 3 note that Sanuski exiled Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Dockside, and wonder what exactly Sanuski has in mind. With Windfall still in the stack, Sanuski casts Chain of Vapor, targeting his own Mox Opal. Zack draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Sanuski adds a red through Birgi. Chain resolves, bouncing Mox Opal back to Sanuski's hand, and then he sacrifices Blood Crypt to copy the chain, targeting his own Mana Crypt. Crypt bounces, he sacrifices a Badlands to copy the chain, targeting his own Talisman of Dominance. Talisman bounces, he sacrifices Gemstone Caverns to copy the chain, targeting Zack's Drannith Magistrate. Drannith bounces, and Zack sacrifices a Tundra to copy the chain, targeting Sanuski's Burgi. Burgi bounces, and Sanuski doesn't continue the chain. Then Fierce Guardianship resolves, countering Windfall. Next, Sanuski casts Mana Crypt. Zack draws 2 and Memo draws 1. He casts Mox Opal. Zack draws 2 and Memo draws 1 again. Sanuski follows it up with a Mnemonic Betrayal. Zack draws 2 and Memo draws 1. In response, Zane casts Swan Song, targeting Betrayal. Remora, Rhystic, Esper Sentinel, and Remora all trigger. In response, Sanuski pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Swan Song. Zack draws 2 and Memo draws 1, and in response, Memo casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Mnemonic Betrayal and Mental Misstep. Remora, Rhystic, and Esper all trigger, and Zack draws 3. Mindbreak Trap resolves, exiling both spells. Then Zack's Remora, Rhystic, and Esper triggers, and Memo's Remora triggers all resolve, and Zack draws 3 and Memo draws 1. Then Swan Song fizzles. Next, Sanuski casts Talisman of Dominance. Zack draws 2 and Memo draws 1. He casts Mystical Tutor. Zack draws 2 and Memo draws 1 again. Then Tutor resolves, and Sanuski fetches up a Demonic Consultation onto the top of his library. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and Memo draws a card and gains a life. After a very long turn, Sanuski passes to Zane. Zane draws for turn and casts Tainted Pact. Remora, Rhystic, Sentinel, and Remora all trigger. Zack draws 3 and Memo draws 1. Then Pact resolves, and Zane exiles until he finds a Mnemonic Betrayal and puts it into his hand. He casts Mnemonic Betrayal. Zack draws 2 and Memo draws 1. In response, Memo casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Betrayal. Remora, Rhystic, and Sentinel all trigger, and Zack draws 3. Force resolves, countering and exiling Mnemonic Betrayal. Zane plays a Flooded Strand. He casts a Mox Opal. Zack draws 2, Memo draws 1, then Opal resolves. Finished up, Zane passes to Memo. During his upkeep, Memo lets his Remora die. During his draw step, he takes the damage from his Mana Vault. He draws and casts Grand Abolisher, paying for Rhystic. In response, Zack casts Force of Will for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Grand Abolisher. In response, Memo casts Pact of Negation, paying for both Rhystic and Sentinel. Remora triggers, and Zack draws. In response, Zane cracks his Flooded Strand, paying a life, but actually fails to find a land. Memo's Archivist of Ogma triggers, and he gains a life and draws a card. Pact of Negation resolves, countering Force of Will. Then Grand Abolisher resolves. Memo plays an Exotic Orchard as his land for turn. He casts a Mana Crypt. Zack skips his draws as he sees the writing on the wall. Memo casts Mox Diamond, discarding a Volcanic Island. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Demonic Consultation. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. He escapes Soul Partition from his graveyard, targeting Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and Oracle is exiled. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He cracks LED and adds 3 blue. He casts Thassa's Oracle from exile. Thassa's Oracle triggers, and in response, Memo escapes Demonic Consultation, naming You Are Already Dead. Consult resolves, and Memo exiles his library. Then Oracle's trigger resolves, and Memo wins the game. Jay wins the tumbling contest and gets to start us off. Jay draws a card for turn and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Praetor's Grasp, targeting Alan. He fetches up a card from Alan's library into exile face down. He casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He passes. Alan draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding a Bloodstained Mire. He ships the turn. Kyle draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow. He ends his turn. Kevin draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He also casts an Elves of Deep Shadow. He gives the turn to Jay. Jay draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. With no other plays, he passes. During his upkeep, Alan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Glenhorn Buccaneer. In response, Kevin casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Glenhorn. In response, Alan casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, changing the target of Force of Will to Swat itself. Force fizzles, and with no other interaction, Glenhorn resolves. Alan moves to combat and attacks Kyle with Malcolm and Jay with Glenhorn. Jay blocks with Rograk, and Kyle takes it. Malcolm triggers, creating a treasure. Still in combat, Alan activates Glenhorn, discarding a card and dealing 1 damage to each opponent and then drawing. Malcolm triggers, creating 3 treasures. He demonstrates a loop by activating Glenhorn, generating treasures, pinging the table to death, and Alan wins the game. Jay draws a card for turn and casts his commander, Rograk, son of Roga. He plays a City of Brass for turn. He taps it to help cast Mystic Remora. He passes. Alan draws and plays a Shivan Reef. He casts a Mana Crypt. Mystic Remora triggers, and Jay draws. He taps Shivan Reef to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He gives the turn to Kyle. Kyle draws and plays a Morphic Pool. Envious of Jay's Mystic Remora, he casts his own Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Jay draws. Kyle ships the turn. Kevin draws and plays an exotic orchard. He casts a Tinderwall. He casts a Lotus Petal. Jay and Kyle draw through Remora, and Kevin passes to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay taps the City of Brass to help pay for his Remora. He draws and casts a Mox Amber. Remora triggers and Kyle draws. Jay pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe targeting Alan. Remora triggers and Kyle draws again. He looks at Alan's hand and draws a card. He casts Strike it Rich, letting Kyle draw. Strike it Rich resolves and Jay creates a treasure. He passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Alan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He taps Shivan Reef to help cast Gamble. Both Remora's trigger and Kyle and Jay draw. Then Alan fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards ad nauseum, which is what he tutored for. A bit dejected, he follows up by casting a Windfall. Kyle and Jay draw, and in response, Kevin casts Worldly Tutor. Remora's trigger and Kyle and Jay draw again. In response, Jay casts Flusterstorm with 2 copies targeting Worldly Tutor and the rest at Windfall. Remora triggers and Kyle draws. In response, Kevin sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red, and pays for both Flusterstorms. Still in response to Flusterstorm, Alan casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost targeting Flusterstorm. Remora triggers and Kyle and Jay draw. Deflecting Swat resolves, and Alan changes the target of one Flusterstorm from Windfall to the other Flusterstorm. In response, Jay casts his own Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Flusterstorm. Remora triggers and Kyle draws again. Swat resolves, and Jay changes the target of Flusterstorm back to Windfall. Flusterstorm finally resolves, countering Windfall. Worldly Tutor then resolves, and Kevin fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. Alan moves to combat and attacks Kyle with Malcolm. Kyle takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and Alan creates a treasure. With his plans foiled, Alan ships the turn. During his upkeep, Kyle pays for his Remora. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it to help cast Deathrite Shaman. He passes, discarding to hand size, which includes a Dread return, and the table starts to worry. Kevin draws and plays a Bayou. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Alan cracks a treasure. Dockside resolves, and Kevin creates 4 treasures. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Jay lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Rite of Flame, letting Kyle draw. Rite resolves, and Jay adds 2 red. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Jessica's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Kyle. Remora triggers, and Kyle draws. Jessica's Will resolves, Jay adds 9 red, and then exiles Dark Slick Shores, an offer you can't refuse, and a Windfall. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Windfall. Remora triggers, and Kyle chooses not to draw. Windfall resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 9 cards. Jay casts a Mox Diamond, and Kyle draws through Remora. Mox Diamond resolves, and Jay discards a Blood Crypt. He casts Mana Vault, and Kyle draws again. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside resolves, and Jay creates 3 treasures. He casts Final Fortune, and Kyle draws again. He casts a Wheel of Misfortune, letting Kyle draw. Wheel resolves, Jay chooses 20, Alan chooses 10, Kyle chooses 14, and Kevin chooses 0. Jay takes 20 damage, then Jay, Alan, and Kyle each discard their hand and draw 7. Jay casts a Lotus Petal, and Kyle draws. He casts a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Kevin. Remora triggers, and Kyle draws again. In response, Kevin casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Praetor's Grasp. Kyle draws again, then Flusterstorm resolves, countering Praetor's Grasp. Next, Jay casts Imperial Seal, letting Kyle draw. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He casts a Guild Artisan, and Kyle draws. Jay moves to combat, attacking Kyle with Rogue Rack. Guild Artisan triggers, and Jay creates 2 treasures. With nothing else, Jay passes the turn to, well, himself. During his draw step, Jay takes a damage from his Mana Vault. He moves to combat and attacks Kyle with Rogue Rack. Guild Artisan triggers, and Jay creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, he casts Demonic Betrayal. Remora triggers, and Kyle draws. Mnemonic Betrayal resolves, exiling each opponent's graveyards. He taps his Mana Confluence and his City of Brass to help cast Grand Abolisher from exile. He casts Mox Diamond from exile, discarding his Steam Vents, and Kyle draws through Remora. He casts Dark Ritual from exile, letting Kyle draw. He adds 3 black. He casts Demonic Tutor from exile, and Kyle draws again. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach, and Kyle draws. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond, and Kyle draws again. He sacrifices his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself. Kyle draws through Remora, and then Brain Freeze resolves. Jay mills 24 cards. He casts Lotus Petal from exile. He escapes LED. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself again, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Jay wins the game. Damien had the most unique life counter at the table and gets to start us off. But Jay has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Wooded Foothills. Damien draws a card for turn and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Birds of Paradise. He passes the turn to Alan. Alan draws and plays a City of Brass. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red to cast Rite of Flame, adding 2 more red. He taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He casts a Mox Amber. All through, he ships the turn to Isaac. Isaac draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He gives the turn to Jay. Jay draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Frantic Search. He draws 2, discards 2, then untaps 2 lands. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Jay ends his turn. Damien draws and plays a volcanic island. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He casts an Elves of Deep Shadow. He passes the turn. Alan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Jay with Malcolm. Jay takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and Alan creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he taps the City of Brass to help cast a Felwar Stone. He gives the turn to Isaac. Isaac draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. Wanting to slow the game down, he casts Suppression Field. He passes the turn to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay casts Mystical Tutor. Krark triggers, he loses the flip, and returns Mystical Tutor back to his hand. Not to be deterred, he recasts Mystical Tutor. Krark triggers, Jay loses the flip again, pouncing Tutor. He draws and plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Tavern Scoundrel. All through, he ships the turn to Damien. Damien draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He moves to combat and attacks Alan with Najeela. Najeela triggers and he creates a 1/1 warrior tapped at attacking Alan. Alan takes the hit and Damien passes the turn. Alan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Jay with Malcolm. Jay takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and Alan creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he casts Talisman of Indulgence. All through, he gives the turn to Isaac. Isaac draws and plays a Strip Mine. He casts a Strict Proctor. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Jay casts Mystical Tutor. Krark triggers, he wins the flip this time, copying Mystical Tutor. Tavern Scoundrel triggers and he creates 2 treasures. He then fetches up a Demonic Tutor onto the top of his library. He draws and casts Dark Ritual. Krark triggers, he loses the flip, bouncing it back to his hand. He shows Krark who's boss and casts Dark Ritual again. Krark triggers, he wins the flip, copying Dark Ritual. Tavern Scoundrel triggers and he creates 2 treasures. Then both Dark Rituals resolve and Jay adds 6 black. He casts Demonic Tutor. Krark triggers, he loses the flip, bouncing it back to his hand. He recasts Demonic Tutor. Krark triggers, he wins the flip this time, copying Demonic Tutor. Tavern Scoundrel triggers and he creates 2 treasures. Then both Demonic Tutors resolve and he fetches up 2 cards into his hand. He casts Harmonic Prodigy. He casts Ad Nauseam and Krark triggers twice. In response, Damien casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering the original Ad Nauseam. Then Jay wins the first Krark trigger flip, creating a copy of Ad Nauseam. Tavern Scoundrel triggers, and in response, Alan casts his own Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering the copy of Ad Nauseam. Then Jay creates 2 treasures through Scoundrel. His last Krark trigger resolves, he flips, and loses. Krark gets the last laugh as Jay casts his other commander, Silas Wren, Seeker Adept. Very dejected, Jay passes the turn. At the end of Jay's turn, Damien cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life and 2 mana for Suppression Field, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Tainted Pact. In response, Alan taps the City of Brass to help cast Swan Song, countering Pact. Damien creates a 2/2 bird, and the turn moves to Damien. Damien draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alan with Najeela and a warrior. Najeela triggers and he creates 2 more warriors tapped and attacking Alan. Alan takes the hit, and still in combat, Damien activates Najeela, paying for Suppression Field. He untaps his attackers, moves to his next combat phase, and attacks Alan with Najeela and 3 warriors. Najeela triggers and he creates 4 more warriors tapped and attacking Alan. Alan takes the hit again, and Damien ships the turn. At the end of Damien's turn, Alan casts Intuition targeting Isaac. He fetches up a Glenhorn Buccaneer, Reanimate, and a Mizzix's Mastery. Isaac gives him Mizzix's Mastery, and the turn moves to Alan. Alan draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding a land. He decides to hold back with Malcolm and gives the turn to Isaac. Isaac draws and plays a Core Haven. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it to help cast his commander, Myrel, Shield of Argive. He ends his turn. Jay draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He passes the turn to Damien. Damien draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alan with Najeela, 7 warriors, and his bird. Najeela triggers and he creates 8 more warriors tapped and attacking Alan. Alan, not wanting to go down without a fight, blocks Najeela with Malcolm. Before damage, Damien casts Snap targeting Malcolm. In response, Isaac activates Strip Mine, paying for Suppression Field, destroying Damien's Taiga. Then Snap bounces Malcolm back to hand and Damien untaps 2 lands. Then Alan takes the rest and dies. Damien ships the turn to Isaac. Isaac draws and moves to combat. He attacks Damien with Myrel. Myrel triggers and Isaac creates a 1/1 soldier. Damien takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Isaac casts Torpor Orb. He gives the turn to Jay. Jay draws and casts Mystic Remora. With nothing else, he passes the turn. Damien draws and casts Ignoble Hierarch. He moves to combat and attacks Isaac with 15 warriors. Najeela triggers and he creates 15 more warriors tapped and attacking Isaac. Isaac blocks 2 and takes the rest. Damien ships the turn. Isaac draws and casts Sphere of Resistance. Remora triggers and Jay draws. He passes the turn to Jay. During his upkeep, Jay lets his Remora die. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it to help cast Peer into the Abyss. Krark triggers twice, and in response, Damien casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Peer, tapping his Elves of Deep Shadow to pay for Sphere of Resistance. Peer is countered and Jay flips for the first Krark trigger. He wins, creating a copy of Peer into the Abyss. Tavern Scoundrel triggers and he creates 2 treasures. Then Jay draws half of the cards in his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. Seeing if lightning can strike twice, he flips for the second Krark trigger, but loses. He casts Rite of Flame. Quark triggers twice, he loses the first flip, bouncing the original, wins the second flip, adding 2 red, and then he creates 2 treasures through Tavern Scoundrel. He casts Rite of Flame again. Quark triggers twice, he wins the first flip, adding 2 red and creating 2 treasures through Scoundrel. He loses the second flip, returning the original back to his hand. He recasts Rite of Flame and Quark triggers twice. He loses both flips and returns Rite of Flame to his hand. He recasts Rite of Flame and Quark triggers twice. He wins both flips, creates 4 treasures through Scoundrel, and adds 6 red. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Veyron, Voice of Duality. He escapes Rite of Flame, triggering Quark 3 times. He wins all 3 flips, creates 6 treasures through Scoundrel, and adds 8 red. He casts Brain Freeze, targeting Damien, triggering Quark 3 times. He wins all 3 flips, creates 6 treasures through Scoundrel, and Damien mills. Jay escapes Brain Freeze, targeting Damien, triggering Quark 3 times. He loses all 3 flips and returns Brain Freeze to his hand. Brain Freeze's Storm trigger still resolves, and Damien mills again. Jay presents a loop of casting or escaping Brain Freeze, targeting himself when necessary, and milling out his opponents until they have milled their entire library. He passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. One by one, each player attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Jay wins the game. Peter opens the One Ring to rule them all, and gets to start us off. Peter draws for turn and plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. He passes. Sean draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Spellseeker. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He taps his Windswept Teeth for a black through Urborg. He casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Demonic Consultation resolves, and Mike names Mana Crypt. He exiles cards from his library until he reveals a Mana Crypt, putting them into his hand. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts Talisman of Dominance. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Red Elemental Blast. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast a Mana Vault. He casts Jaxus the Troublemaker. He gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and casts Jeweled Lotus. He plays a City of Traders for turn. He sacrifices Jeweled Lotus and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth. He pays 2 life through Kirik to help cast Buried Alive. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He fetches up a Hoarding Broodlord, Vilis Broker of Blood, and a Razaketh the Foulblooded into his graveyard. He pays 2 life to cast Reanimate, targeting Vilis. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Vilis enters and Peter loses 8 life. Vilis triggers and Peter draws 8 cards. He activates Vilis twice, paying 8 life through Kirik, targeting Jaxus. Vilis triggers and Peter draws 8. Then Jaxus gets -2/-2. He casts Mox Amber. He pays 2 life to cast Cabal Ritual. Kirik gets a counter. Peter draws 2 through Vilis, then adds 3 black. He pays 2 life to help cast Demonic Tutor. Kirik gets a counter. Peter draws 2, then he fetches up a card into his hand. He pays 2 life to cast Sacrifice, sacrificing Vilis as an additional cost. Kirik gets a counter. Peter draws 2 through Vilis, and then he adds 8 black. He casts Exhume. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter returns Vilis to the battlefield. He pays 2 life to cast Wishclaw Talisman. Kirik gets a counter, and Peter draws 2 through Vilis. He activates Wishclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Ryan. He pays 2 life to cast Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Kirik gets a counter, Peter draws 2 through Vilis, and Grey Merchant resolves. It enters, and each opponent loses 8 life, and Peter gains 24. He casts Grim Monolith. He pays 4 life to cast Dark Petition. Kirik gets a counter, Peter draws 4 cards through Vilis, and then Dark Petition resolves. He fetches up a card into his hand and adds 3 black. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Calling the Weak, sacrificing Grey Merchant of Asphodel as an additional cost. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter adds 4 black. He pays 4 life to help cast Professor Onyx. Kirik gets a counter, Peter draws 4 through Vilis, and then Onyx resolves. He pays 2 life to cast Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Kirik, Vilis, and Professor Onyx triggers. Each opponent loses 2 and Peter gains 2. He draws 2 through Vilis, then Kirik gets a counter. Peter presents a loop of copying Chain of Smog, targeting himself, discarding 2 cards, and Professor Onyx triggering each time. He does this over and over, draining his opponents until they are dead, and Peter wins the game. Sean draws for turn and was punished for his super risky keep. He takes no game actions and passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He taps it to help cast Esper Sentinel. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts Birds of Paradise. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts Mox Opal. Esper Sentinel triggers and Ryan pays. He ships the turn. Peter draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws, again takes no game actions, and passes, discarding to hand size. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Esper Sentinel. Peter takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Felwar Stone. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Mike draws. He ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Dark Ritual, and Mike draws through Esper. Then Peter adds 3 black. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Buried Alive. He fetches up Razaketh the Foulblooded, Vilis Broker of Blood, and a Hoarding Broodlord into his graveyard. He casts Mana Crypt. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth. He ends his turn. Sean draws and finally finds what he needed. He plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Tinderwall. He sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts a Soul Ring, and Mike draws through Esper. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Bergi, God of Storytelling. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mystic Remora. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters and Mike creates 6 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Najeela and Ryan with Esper Sentinel. Najeela triggers and Mike creates a warrior tapped and attacking Ryan. Both players declare no blocks and in response, Mike activates Najeela. He untaps his creatures and they gain lifelink, trample, and haste. Then Mike gets an additional combat. Peter and Ryan take the hit and Mike gains 5. He moves to his additional combat and attacks Peter with Najeela and Ryan with a warrior and Esper Sentinel. Najeela triggers, creating 2 warriors tapped and attacking Ryan. Peter and Ryan take the hit and Mike gains 5 again. Mike passes. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He casts his own Dockside Extortionist. In response, Mike sacrifices 3 treasures to add a blue, green, and a white. Dockside enters and Ryan creates 5 treasures. He casts a Metal Worker. He ships the turn. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and pays 4 life to help cast Final Parting. Keurig, Remora, and Esper trigger. Mike and Sean both draw, and in response to Keurig, Ryan casts Thunderclap for its alternate cost, sacrificing a mountain, targeting Keurig. Remora and Esper trigger, Ryan pays for Esper, and Sean draws off of Remora. Then Keurig dies, and Final Parting resolves. Peter fetches up a card into his hand and Grey Merchant of Asphodel into his graveyard. Severely set back, he gives the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean lets his Remora die. He draws and casts a Mana Crypt, letting Mike draw through Esper. He casts Imperial Recruiter. Recruiter enters and Sean fetches up his own Dockside Extortionist into his hand. He casts Dockside. In response, Ryan sacrifices 2 treasures, adding 2 red. Dockside enters and Sean creates 7 treasures. He casts an Underworld Breach. He escapes Bergi, God of Storytelling. He casts Goblin Bombardment. Bergi triggers and Sean adds a red. He casts his commander, Dargo, the Shipwrecker, reduced through his treasures. Bergi triggers and Sean adds a red again. He sacrifices Dargo through Bombardment, dealing 1 damage to Peter. He recasts Dargo, adding a red through Bergi. Sean presents a loop of sacrificing Dargo through Goblin Bombardment, dealing a damage to an opponent, then recasting it, reduced through the previous sacrifice, adding a red through Bergi each time. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Sean wins the game. Mike draws for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts a Rhystic Study. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices his Lotus to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. With a crazy start out of the gate, Mike passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mox Diamond. Rhystic Study triggers and Ryan pays. Diamond resolves and he discards a Gemstone Caverns. He gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and casts Jeweled Lotus, letting Mike draw. He plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb, sacrifices his Jeweled Lotus, and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Keurig, son of Yawgmoth. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws again. Peter pays 4 life to cast Dauthi Voidwalker. Keurig and Rhystic trigger, Mike draws, and Keurig gets a counter. He pays 2 life to help cast Witchclaw Talisman. Mike draws, and Keurig gets another counter. With nothing else, Peter ships the turn. Sean draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts no spells and passes. At the end of Sean's turn, he reminds everyone to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment about your favorite part of tonight's game. Mike draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Najeela. Najeela triggers and Mike creates a warrior tapped and attacking Ryan. Ryan takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike casts a Soul Ring. He ends his turn. Ryan draws, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and ships the turn. Peter draws and taps Ancient Tomb to help activate Wishclaw. He fetches up a card into his hand and gives the Monkey's Paw to Ryan. He pays 2 life to help cast Cabal Ritual. Keurig and Rhystic trigger, Mike draws, and Keurig gets a counter. Then Peter adds 3 black. He casts Balthor the Defiled, letting Mike draw and putting a 1/1 counter on Keurig. In response, Sean cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. In a bold move, Sean casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Rhystic Study, trying to force Mike to interact. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. In response, Mike casts Snap, targeting Dauthi Voidwalker. Dauthi bounces and Mike untaps 2 lands. Still in response to Chain, Mike casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Chain of Vapor. Swat resolves and Mike changes the target of Chain to Keurig. Chain resolves, bouncing Keurig. In another bold move, Peter sacrifices Ancient Tomb to copy the Chain, targeting Rhystic Study again. Rhystic gets bounced and Mike ends the chain. Then Balthor finally resolves. Next, Peter casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Knowing that this is a huge problem, Sean responds by casting Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling LED. With his plans foiled, Peter passes the turn. Sean draws and plays Beseiju, who endures. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Najeela and his warrior token. Najeela triggers, creating 2 warriors tapped and attacking Ryan. Ryan takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike recasts Rhystic Study. He ships the turn. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He activates Witchclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw back to Peter. He casts Dockside Extortionist, paying for Rhystic. Dockside enters and Ryan creates 4 treasures. He casts Treasonous Ogre, letting Mike draw through Rhystic. In response, Mike casts Silence. Silence resolves, then Treasonous Ogre resolves. Unable to cast any spells, Ryan ends his turn. Peter draws, takes no game actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Sean casts Worldly Tutor, letting Mike draw through Rhystic. He fetches up his own Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. He draws and casts Dockside. Mike draws through Rhystic, Dockside resolves, and Sean creates 4 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Ragavan. Mike takes it, Ragavan triggers, Sean creates a treasure, and Mike exiles a final fortune. In his second main phase, Sean casts Dargo, sacrificing Ragavan, Dockside, and a treasure as an additional cost. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. He casts Jessica's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Mike, paying for Rhystic. In response, Mike casts Demonic Consultation. It resolves and Mike names Fierce Guardianship. He exiles the top 6, then exiles all but the last 10 cards, putting Fierce Guardianship into his hand. He casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Jessica's Will. With nothing else, Sean gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Gemstone Caverns. He casts Grand Abolisher. With no answers, it resolves, locking out opponents. He taps Tarnished Citadel to help cast a Tinderwall. He casts Talisman of Curiosity. He sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts Samut, Vizier of Noctamoon. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Najeela, Samut, and 3 of his warriors. Najeela triggers, creating 5 warriors tapped and attacking Peter. Peter blocks one of the new warriors with Balthor and takes the rest. Samut triggers 5 times and Mike draws 5 cards. Mike sighs because he still cannot find his Thassa's Oracle. In his second main phase, he casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Mystic Remora. He ships the turn. Ryan draws and casts Curse Mirror. Esper and Remora trigger, and Mike draws 2. Mike knows that this is a Dockside Extortionist and pleads with the table to counter it. No one does, and Curse Mirror resolves. Mirror enters as a Grand Abolisher. With the table now locked out, Ryan activates Treasonous Ogre, paying 3 life, adding a red. He casts Grim Monolith, and Mike declines his Rhystic triggers. Ryan activates Treasonous Ogre, paying 9 life, adding 3 red. He casts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. Godo enters, and Ryan fetches up a Hammer of Nazan onto the battlefield. Hammer triggers, and Ryan equips it to Godo. He pays 12 life to activate Treasonous Ogre, adding 4 red. He casts Helm of the Host. It enters, Hammer triggers, and Ryan equips Helm to Godo. He moves to combat, creating a copy of Godo. He attacks Sean with Godo, getting in additional combat. Sean takes it, and Ryan moves to his extra combat, creating another Godo. He repeats this process to get infinite combat steps, killing the table, and Ryan wins the game. Sean revealed the highest mana value card off of the Dan deck and gets to start us off. But Brandon has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Leaf Crown Visionary. Sean draws a card for turn and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Rejuvenating Springs. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Off to a fast start, Sean ends his turn. Ryan draws, plays a Scalding Tarn, and passes. Andrew draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices his Lotus to help cast his commander, Najeela, the Blade Blossom. In response, Sean casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Najeela. Remora triggers, and Andrew draws. Bemoaning his sequencing, Najeela is exiled to the command zone. Andrew casts Mana Crypt and then ships the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Andrew draws. He then casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. Brandon moves to his end step, and Sean, displaying an equal disdain for all commanders, casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Marwyn. Remora triggers and Andrew draws. Then Bolt kills Marwyn, and the turn moves to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He sacrifices his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 blue. He casts his commander, Borborygmos and Fibblethip. In response, Ryan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. Ryan, having previously stated that he will attempt to counter anything that uses LED as a cost, casts Pyroblast, targeting Sean's commander. Remora triggers and Andrew draws. Sean can do nothing but sigh, and Borborygmos and Fibblethip is countered. A dejected Sean places it into the command zone and passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Drannith Magistrate. He ends his turn. During Andrew's upkeep, Remora and Mana Crypt trigger. He wins his Mana Crypt flip, and then with a Remora trigger on the stack, he casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He then casts Ad Nauseam. The table is out of interaction, and Ad Naus resolves. Andrew reveals a Command Tower, Drannith Magistrate, Mental Misstep, Taiga, Tropical Island, Plateau, Ranger Captain of Eos, Talisman of Dominance, Flusterstorm, Imperial Seal, Red Elemental Blast, Chrome Mox, Underground Sea, Pact of Negation, Mana Vault, Misty Rainforest, Flooded Strand, Mox Opal, Scalding Tarn, Marsh Flats, Grim Hireling, Verdant Catacombs, Scrubland, Intuition, City of Traders, Felwar Stone, Arcane Signet, Tainted Pact, Mystical Tutor, Savannah, Veil of Summer, Ignoble Hierarch, Mindbreak Trap, Savine's Reclamation, and a Jataxian Probe, deciding to stop there. Then Andrew lets his Remora die. He draws for turn and casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Fierce Guardianship. He plays a City of Traders. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts Talisman of Dominance. He taps his Talisman to help cast Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with the trigger on the stack, Andrew casts Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Andrew wins the game. But Andrew has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Taiga. Ryan draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mox Opal. He taps a City of Brass to cast a Soul Ring. He casts a Grim Monolith. He casts a Wheel of Fortune, drawing groans from the other 3 players. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Off to a fast start, Ryan ends his turn. Andrew draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Felwar Stone. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer. Having taken full advantage of the wheel, Andrew passes. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Soul Ring. He ships the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts his own Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer. Sean ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Mana Confluence. He taps the City of Brass to cast Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. And then he casts, surprise, Ad Nauseam. Ad Naus resolves, and Ryan reveals an Arid Mesa, Vanishing Verse, Calling the Weak, Blood Crypt, Tainted Pact, Lotus Petal, Grinding Station, Dockside Extortionist, Imperial Seal, Saw in Half, Diabolic Intent, Dualcaster Mage, Archivist of Ogma, Twin Flame, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Phyrexian Tower, Touch the Spirit Realm, Silence, Lion's Eye Diamond, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff, Imperial Recruiter, Infernal Plunge, Rite of Flame, and an Underworld Breach, deciding against suicide and stopping there. Ryan exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts a Lotus Petal, and then immediately cracks it to cast Silence, so as to not have anyone disrupt his power trip. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 red. He escapes Dragon's Rage Channeler. He escapes his LED. Darcy triggers, Ryan surveils, putting Cavern of Souls into his graveyard. He then cracks his LED, adding 3 red. He escapes Twin Flame, targeting Darcy. Darcy triggers, Ryan surveils, putting Lightning Bolt into his graveyard. Holding priority, Ryan escapes Dualcaster Mage. It enters, triggers, and targets Twin Flame. Twin Flame is copied, and Ryan targets Dualcaster Mage with the copy. Ryan presents a loop of copying Dualcaster with the Twin Flame copy, then using Dualcaster's ability to create another copy of Twin Flame to target Dualcaster. He then creates an infinite number of hasty tokens. Ryan moves to combat and sends his Agent Smith army at everyone, and Ryan wins the game. Mike swatted a mosquito the fastest and gets to start us off. But Corey has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Misty Rainforest. Hunter draws a card for turn and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Arcane Signet. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Finished up, Hunter passes to Corey. Corey draws and plays a Badlands. He casts Witchclaw Talisman. He ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Plateau. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Off to an explosive start. Mike ends his turn. Bailey draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Mox Diamond. Remora triggers and Mike draws. Diamond enters and Bailey discards a Blood Crypt. He casts Dothy Voidwalker and passes the turn. Hunter draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Rhystic Study. Remora triggers and Mike draws. Finished up, Hunter ends his turn. Corey draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. With no other actions, he passes. During Mike's upkeep, he pays for his Mystic Remora and wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Tundra. He casts Grand Abolisher, paying the Rhystic tax. He casts a Mana Vault. Rhystic Study triggers and Hunter draws. Finished up, Mike ships the turn to Bailey. During Bailey's upkeep, Corey cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. Bailey draws, takes no actions, and passes. Hunter draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. Hunter passes. Corey draws and casts a Mana Crypt. Remora and Rhystic trigger, Corey pays for Rhystic, and with the Remora trigger still in the stack, Bailey casts Dark Ritual. Remora and Rhystic trigger again, Hunter and Mike draw, then Bailey adds 3 black. Bailey then fletches in a Notion Thief. Rhystic triggers and Hunter draws. With nothing else, Corey ships the turn to Mike. At the end of Corey's turn, Hunter taps his Ancient Tomb to help flash in an Opposition Agent. In response, Corey activates Witchclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and then giving Witchclaw to Bailey. The turn moves to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll and pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and casts a Lotus Petal. Hunter declines to draw through Rhystic because of Bailey's Notion Thief, and then Mike ends the turn. Bailey draws and casts Talisman of Creativity. Mike also declines to draw through Remora because of Notion Thief. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Notion Thief. Corey takes it, and with nothing else, the turn moves to Hunter. Hunter draws and taps Ancient Tomb to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He passes. During his upkeep, Corey wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts the One Ring, gaining protection from everything until his next turn. Corey passes. During Mike's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage, and then pays to keep his Remora. He draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. Bailey draws and casts Praetor's Grasp, targeting Corey. In response, Hunter casts Flusterstorm, countering Praetor's Grasp. Finished up, Bailey passes to Hunter. Hunter draws and taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Hunter fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Birds of Paradise. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Najeela. Najeela triggers, and Hunter creates a 1/1 warrior tapped and attacking Corey. Corey declares no blocks and takes no damage due to protection from the One Ring. All through, Hunter ends his turn. During Corey's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, comments that the board state sucks right now, and casts Ad Nauseam. In response, Bailey casts Force of Negation for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, countering and exiling Ad Nauseam. Corey sighs and passes to Mike. During Mike's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage, and then pays to keep his Remora. He draws, does nothing else, and passes. Bailey draws and casts Bergi, God of Storytelling. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Notion Thief. Corey takes it, and Bailey ships the turn to Hunter. Hunter draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Najeela and a warrior. Najeela triggers, and Hunter creates 2 more warriors tapped and attacking Corey. Corey takes it, and in his second main phase, Hunter casts Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, deals 1 damage to Notion Thief, killing it, and Hunter amasses 1. He casts Esper Sentinel. In response, Corey activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. Bowmasters triggers, Hunter pings Corey and amasses 1. With nothing else, the turn moves to Corey. During his upkeep, Corey wins his Mana Crypt roll, then loses a life through the One Ring. He draws and then activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2. Bowmasters triggers twice, and Hunter targets Grand Abolisher with both triggers, killing it and exiling it with a Void counter, then amasses 2. Next, Corey casts Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff, paying the Rhystic tax. All through, Corey passes to Mike. During Mike's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage, and then pays to keep his Remora. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He does nothing else and passes. Bailey draws and sacrifices Dauthi Voidwalker to help cast Grand Abolisher from exile. Bergi and Rhystic trigger, Hunter draws, and in response to Grand Abolisher, Hunter casts Cyclonic Rift targeting Bergi. Remora triggers and Mike draws. Bowmasters triggers, and Hunter has it deal 1 damage to Lotho, killing it and amassing 1. Then Bailey adds a red, and Grand Abolisher resolves. Bailey then casts his commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. Rhystic triggers, and Hunter draws. With nothing else, Bailey sends the turn to Hunter. Hunter draws and casts Grand Abolisher. In response, Corey casts Swords to Plowshares targeting Najeela. Remora, Rhystic, and Esper Sentinel trigger. Hunter draws 2, and Mike draws 1. Bowmasters triggers, Hunter pings Bailey's Grand Abolisher, and then amasses 1. With Swords still in the stack, Hunter pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep targeting Swords. Remora and Crom trigger. Bailey draws, Bowmasters triggers, Hunter pings Grand Abolisher, killing it and amasses 1. Mike draws, Bowmasters triggers again, and Hunter pings Mike, then amasses 1 again. Still in response, Mike casts Red Elemental Blast targeting Misstep. Rhystic and Esper Sentinel trigger, and Hunter draws 2. He doesn't find what he needs, and Red Blast resolves, countering Misstep. Then Swords resolves, Najeela is exiled, and Hunter gains 3. With Hunter's Abolisher still on the stack, Mike casts Silence, paying the Rhystic tax. Crom triggers, and Bailey draws. Bowmasters triggers, Hunter pings Bailey, and then amasses 1. Silence resolves, locking out Mike's opponents from casting spells this turn. Then finally, after what seems like forever, Grand Abolisher resolves. Hunter plays an Exotic Orchard as his land for turn. He passes to Corey. During Corey's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage, and then loses 2 life through the One Ring. He draws and casts his commander, Dihada, Binder of Wills. Rhystic, Esper, and Remora all trigger. Hunter draws 2, and Mike draws 1. Bowmasters triggers, Hunter pings Mike, then amasses 1. Then Dihada resolves. Corey activates Dihada's second ability, revealing the top 4 cards of his library and putting them into his graveyard, creating 4 treasures. Corey then casts Grand Abolisher, paying the Rhystic tax. Crom triggers, and Bailey draws. Bowmasters triggers, Hunter pings Bailey, and amasses 1. With Abolisher still in the stack, Hunter sacrifices Ranger Captain of Eos. In response to the Ranger Captain ability, Corey casts Final Fortune. Remora and Rhystic trigger, Hunter draws, then Mike draws. Bowmasters triggers, Hunter pings Bailey, and then amasses 1. In response, Hunter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Final Fortune and Grand Abolisher. Remora triggers, and Mike draws. Bowmasters triggers, Hunter pings Bailey, and amasses 1. In response, Corey activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing 3 cards. Bowmasters triggers 3 times, Hunter deals 3 to Bailey, and amasses 3. With no more interaction, Mindbreak Trap exiles both Grand Abolisher and Final Fortune. Then Ranger Captain's ability resolves, locking out Hunter's opponents from casting non-creature spells this turn. Locked out, and with his draws being uncooperative, Corey ships the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also lets his Remora die. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts Underworld Breach. Rhystic and Sentinel trigger, and Hunter draws 2. In response, Hunter casts Swan Song, targeting Underworld Breach. In response, Mike casts his own Swan Song, targeting Hunter's Swan Song. Crom and Rhystic trigger, and Hunter and Bailey draw. Bowmaster's triggers, Hunter pings Mike, and then amasses 1. In response to Mike's Swan Song, Hunter casts Veil of Summer. Crom triggers, and Bailey draws again. Bowmaster's triggers, Hunter pings Bailey, and then amasses 1. In response to Veil, Mike casts Dark Ritual. Rhystic triggers, and Hunter draws. Then Mike adds 3 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Rhystic triggers, and with the trigger on the stack, Hunter casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Force of Will onto the top of his library. Still in response to Rhystic, Mike cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. He uses 1 of that to pay for Rhystic. Still in response, Bailey casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Ad Nauseam. Rhystic and Sentinel trigger, and Hunter draws 2. With nothing else, Force counters Naws, Veil of Summer resolves, and Hunter draws. Mike's Swan Song can't counter Hunter's Swan Song because of Veil. Hunter's Swan Song counters Breach, and both Mike and Hunter create a 2/2 bird. With his desperate attempt foiled, Mike passes to Bailey. Bailey draws and casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold. Rhystic and Sentinel trigger, Hunter draws 2, and Bailey adds 5 black. He then casts Yawgmoth's Will. Rhystic triggers, and Hunter draws. In response, Hunter casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Yawg-Will. In response, Bailey casts Swan Song, targeting Force. Rhystic triggers, and Hunter draws. In response, Hunter casts Pact of Negation, targeting Swan Song. Crom triggers, and Bailey draws. Bowmaster triggers, and Hunter pings Bailey and amasses 1. In response, Bailey casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers, and Hunter draws. Then Offer counters Pact, and Hunter creates 2 treasures. Still in response, Hunter casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing a warrior as an additional cost, adding 4 black. Hunter taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Ad Nauseam. With the table out of answers, Ad Naus resolves. Hunter reveals a Demonic Consultation, Witchclaw Talisman, Scalding Tarn, Gamble, Mox Amber, Worldly Tutor, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Silence, Badlands, Wooded Foothills, Chrome Mox, Bloodstained Mire, and a Mnemonic Betrayal, deciding to stop there. Still in response, Hunter casts Silence. Silence resolves, locking out Hunter's opponents from casting spells this turn. Then Swan Song counters Force, Hunter creates a bird, and a depressing Yawgmoth's Will resolves. Dejected, Bailey moves to Crombat and attacks Hunter with Crom. Hunter takes it, and Bailey ends his turn. Hunter draws and casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Hunter creates 8 treasures. He cracks some of his treasures to help recast his commander, Najeela. He then cracks a few more treasures to cast Eladamri's Call. He fetches up a Derevi, Imperial Tactician, into his hand. He casts Derevi. It enters and untaps his Exotic Orchard. He moves to combat and attacks his opponent with his warriors. Najeela triggers, and Hunter creates 2 additional warrior tokens. They all take it, Derevi triggers, and Hunter untaps his lands. Still in combat, he activates Najeela's ability, untapping his attacking creatures and getting in another combat. Hunter presents a loop of attacking with warriors, untapping his lands, activating Najeela, and getting in extra combat. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Hunter wins the game. Alex had the best altered commander and gets to start us off. But Ryan has a pregame action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Snow-Covered Mountain. Alex draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring, he casts a Felwar Stone, and Alex is super grateful to Ryan for his Gemstone Caverns. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Consecrated Sphinx. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. After completely dumping out his hand, Alex passes. Chris draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts a Mystic Remora. Chris passes. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Mana Vault. Remora triggers, and Chris draws. Ryan ends his turn. TK draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Tinder Wall and passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting Elvish Mystic onto the battlefield. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Kinnan. Ryan takes it, and Alex ships the turn. During his upkeep, Chris pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. Chris ends his turn. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and sends the turn to TK. TK draws and plays an Underground Sea. He sacrifices Tinder Wall, adding 2 red. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. TK ends his turn. Alex draws and casts Glen Elendra Archmage. He casts Perplexing Chimera. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Kinnan. Ryan takes it, and Alex gives the turn to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris pays to keep his Remora. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Chris's turn, Ryan activates Urza Saga, creating a construct. Then Chris discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. In response, Ryan activates Urza Saga, creating another construct. Then Ryan sacrifices Saga, fetching up a Grafdigger's Cage onto the battlefield. The table sighs, and Ryan casts Mox Opal. Remora triggers, and Chris draws. Ryan moves to combat and attacks Alex with a construct. Alex takes 5, and then Ryan passes to TK. TK draws and plays a Bayou. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with Najeela. Najeela triggers, and TK puts a 1/1 warrior onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Chris. Chris takes it all, and TK passes to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Treasure Vault. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Glen Elendra and Chris with Perplexing Chimera and Kinnan. They both take it, and Alex passes. During his upkeep, Chris lets his Remora die. He draws and casts a Draneth Magistrate. Chris ends his turn, discarding to hand size. Ryan draws and casts Honor War and Shaku. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with his construct. Alex takes 6, and Ryan passes. TK draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He moves to combat and attacks Alex with Najeela and a warrior. Najeela triggers, creating 2 more warriors tapped and attacking Alex. Alex takes it all, and TK passes. Alex draws and plays an island. He holds up blockers against the onslaught and then sends the turn to Chris. Chris draws, plays a command tower, and passes. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks TK with a construct. TK takes 6, and in his second main phase, he casts Goblin Engineer. Perplexing Chimera triggers, and Alex exchanges control of it and Goblin Engineer. With Engineer still in the stack, Chris casts Stern Scolding, targeting Engineer. In response, Alex activates Glen Elendra, sacrificing it, countering Stern Scolding. Glen Elendra's Persist triggers, but doesn't re-enter due to Grafdigger's Cage. Then Goblin Engineer enters under Alex's control, and he fetches up a Mirage Mirror into his graveyard. Finished up, Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, TK casts Intuition. He fetches up a Samut, Vizier of Noctamoon, Derevi Imperial Tactician, and a Druid's Repository. Chris gives him Samut, the rest go to his graveyard, and the turn moves to TK. TK draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Samut, Vizier of Noctamoon. Perplexing Chimera triggers, and Ryan exchanges control of it. Then Samut resolves. TK moves to combat and attacks Chris with 3 warriors. Najeela triggers, creating 3 more warriors tapped and attacking Chris. Chris blocks 1 with Draneth and then takes the rest. TK passes. At the end of TK's turn, Alex activates Treasure Vault, where X equals 5, sacrificing it. In response, Chris casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Then Alex creates 5 treasures, and the turn moves to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He activates Goblin Engineer, sacrificing a treasure, returning Mirage Mirror to the battlefield. Alex ends his turn. During Chris's upkeep, Alex activates Mirage Mirror, having it become a copy of Perplexing Chimera. Chris draws and casts Out of Time. It enters, untaps and faces out all creatures, and Out of Time gets 15 counters. After wiping the board, or more appropriately phasing the board, Chris passes. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts Chrome Mox, Imprinting a Braid. He casts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. In response, TK casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Godo. Ryan ends his turn. TK draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Talisman of Dominance. He passes. Alex draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Chris removes a counter from Out of Time. He draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Chris ends his turn. During Ryan's upkeep, Chris casts Silence, locking out opponents from spells this turn. Ryan draws, can't do anything, so he passes. TK draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He ships his turn. Alex draws and casts Transmute Artifact. He sacrifices Felwar Stone, fetching up the One Ring onto the battlefield, paying the difference. He activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter and drawing a card. He plays a Breeding Pool into play tapped, and then gives the turn to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris removes a counter from Out of Time. He draws and casts Grand Abolisher. In response, Alex taps Mana Confluence to hard cast Mindbreak Trap. In response, Chris casts Swan Song. Trap is countered, Alex creates a 2/2 bird, and then Grand Abolisher resolves. With nothing else, Chris sends the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws, casts a Grim Monolith, and passes. TK draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts an Esper Sentinel and passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex loses a life from the One Ring. He also activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He draws and then casts a Lotus Petal. He taps Mana Confluence to cast a Void Winnower. He pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters, as a copy, a Void Winnower. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with his bird. Ryan takes it, and Alex passes. During his upkeep, Chris removes a counter from Out of Time. He draws and casts Eternal Scourge. Chris passes. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. TK draws, also takes no actions, and ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses 2 life from the One Ring. He then activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with everything. Chris blocks one of the Winnowers with Eternal Scourge and takes the rest. In his second main phase, Alex casts a Trinisphere. All through, Alex passes. During his upkeep, Chris removes a counter from Out of Time. He draws and passes the turn. Ryan draws, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and ships the turn to TK. TK draws, and being locked out by the Void Winnowers, also does nothing and passes to Alex. During his upkeep, Alex loses 3 life through the One Ring. He also activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 4 cards. He draws and plays a command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Chris with Void Winter. Since Chris can't block with even creatures, he takes it all and dies. Out of Time leaves the battlefield and all creatures phase back in. In his second main phase, Alex casts Mox Opal. Esper Sentinel triggers and Alex pays. Alex passes the turn. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alex with both constructs. Alex blocks with his bird and his Elvish Mystic. Both creatures die, and in his second main phase, Ryan casts Rolling Earthquake, where X equals 12. Alex, knowing he is dead if this resolves, thinks of a plan. He activates Mirage Mirror, making it a copy of the One Ring, sacrificing the original. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He casts Whir of Invention, where X equals 4, improvising Trinisphere to help cast it, shutting off Trinisphere. Unfortunately, Perplexing Chimera triggers. TK then exchanges control of Whir and Chimera. Whir resolves and TK fetches up the One Ring onto the battlefield. With no other answers and nothing else to do, Earthquake resolves. Each creature and each player takes 12. All creatures die, and Alex dies too. With nothing else, Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, TK activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. During his upkeep, TK loses a life to the One Ring. He also activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Grand Abolisher. He taps his Ancient Doom to help recast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. TK ends his turn. During his draw step, Ryan takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he recasts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Hammer of Nazan onto the battlefield. Hammer triggers, and in response, TK taps his City of Brass to cast Swords of Plowshares targeting Godo. Godo is exiled, and Ryan gains 3 life. Ryan ships the turn. During his upkeep, TK loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He also loses 2 life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3 cards. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Najeela as an additional cost, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and with a trigger on the stack, TK casts Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and TK wins the game.